You've been taught that peace comes after everything is complete, after the answers are found, after the past is resolved, after life finally makes sense. But if that were true, why does calm vanish the moment something feels uncertain? Why does the mind tighten when things are left unfinished? Why does waiting feel heavier than pain itself? The truth is simple. Life is not meant to be completed, and peace is not a reward for finishing it. Acceptance is allowing life to be unfinished, not as failure, not as weakness, but as a natural state of being. Buddhist teachings have pointed to this truth for centuries, that suffering does not come from uncertainty. It comes from resisting it, from demanding closure where none exists. The Buddha did not promise answers. He taught how to live without needing them. He did not offer control. He showed how freedom begins when we stop grasping. Tonight, as you listen, the pressure to resolve everything can begin to loosen. The urge to force meaning can soften. The restless need for certainty can slowly fade. You may feel your mind slow down, like a hand unclenching, like a breath finally allowed to leave. This is not about giving up on life. It is about giving up the fight with it. It is learning to stand inside the unfinished, without fear, without judgment, without turning incompleteness into suffering. This is not the end of the search. It is the end of the struggle. Acceptance is allowing life to be unfinished and finding peace right there. If you are ready, let us begin. Something subtle happens after the idea of acceptance settles in. The mind pauses, not because it has found answers, but because it senses a different way of living, a way that does not rush to conclude, a way that does not panic when clarity does not arrive. This is where the deeper work begins, not by adding more understanding, but by learning how to stay when understanding is absent. From early on, most of us are trained to believe that questions are problems. If something is unclear, we assume it must be fixed. If something does not make sense, we assume we have failed to understand it properly. We grow up rewarded for correct answers, fast conclusions, clear opinions. Over time, the mind begins to crave certainty, the way the body craves food. When answers are missing, tension appears. When outcomes are unknown, anxiety grows. When life does not explain itself, the mind tightens and starts searching desperately for something solid to hold on to. But Buddhism approaches this tension from a very different direction. It does not treat unanswered questions as gaps to be filled. It treats them as spaces to be entered. In this view, wisdom does not always come from knowing more. Sometimes it comes from knowing how to remain present when knowing is not available. Leaving questions unanswered is not a failure of intelligence. It is a spiritual skill, one that requires patience, humility, and trust in the unfolding nature of reality. When clarity is forced, it often becomes shallow. The mind grabs the first explanation that reduces discomfort, not the one that reflects truth. This is why people cling to rigid beliefs, fixed identities, and simple stories about complex experiences. The explanation may be incomplete, but it feels safe. Buddhism sees this as a subtle form of suffering, not because beliefs are wrong, but because the need for certainty itself becomes a source of inner pressure. In Buddhist practice, uncertainty is not something to escape, it is something to sit with. The unanswered question becomes a teacher. When you stop demanding clarity, you begin to notice what the demand was doing to you. You see how much energy was spent trying to control outcomes, predict the future, or rewrite the past. You notice how often the mind says, "I cannot be at peace until this makes sense." And slowly, gently, that belief starts to loosen. One of the Buddha's most radical teachings was his refusal to answer certain metaphysical questions. People asked him about the origin of the universe, the nature of the self after death, the ultimate structure of reality. He did not respond with explanations. He redirected attention back to suffering, awareness, and liberation. This was not avoidance, it was precision. He understood that some questions do not lead to freedom. They lead to endless thinking, endless debate, endless mental loops that distract from direct experience. This does not mean Buddhism rejects inquiry. It means it distinguishes between questions that awaken and questions that entangle. Some questions open the heart and sharpen awareness. Others keep the mind spinning without resolution. The spiritual skill is learning to sense the difference. When a question pulls you deeper into presence, it is useful. When it pulls you into anxiety, rumination, or self-judgment, it may be time to let it remain unanswered. Modern life makes this skill especially difficult. We live in a culture that celebrates explanations. Search engines, self-help books, productivity systems, and psychological labels promise to explain everything. Why you feel this way, why relationships fail, why happiness disappears. While these tools can be helpful, they can also reinforce the belief that every experience must be understood immediately. When understanding does not come, people assume something is wrong with them. Buddhist acceptance invites a different response. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" it asks, "Can I be with this?" Instead of asking, "When will this end?" it asks, "What is happening right now?" These questions do not demand answers. They invite awareness. They shift attention from explanation to presence. And in that shift, wisdom begins to deepen in ways that cannot be forced. Leaving a question unanswered does not mean ignoring it. It means allowing it to breathe. Many insights arrive not through effort, but through space. When the mind stops pushing for resolution, something else takes over. Understanding ripens quietly, like fruit on a tree. It comes when conditions are ready, not when the ego demands it. There is also a deep compassion in this practice. When you stop demanding clarity from yourself, you stop treating your inner life like a problem to be solved. Emotions no longer need immediate explanations. Confusion no longer means failure. You begin to relate to yourself with patience instead of pressure. This softens the inner environment, making genuine insight more likely. Buddhism recognizes that reality itself is not always clear. Impermanence means things are constantly changing. Interdependence means causes are complex and overlapping. No single explanation can capture the full truth of an experience. When you demand certainty in an uncertain world, you create friction. When you allow uncertainty, you move with life instead of against it. This is why uncertainty is treated as a practice, not a flaw. Sitting with not knowing trains the mind to remain steady without guarantees. It builds resilience that does not depend on answers. Over time, you discover that peace does not require clarity. It requires openness. It requires the willingness to stay present even when the story is unfinished. Many people fear that if they stop seeking answers, they will become passive or indifferent. Buddhism does not support this fear. Letting go of the demand for clarity does not mean giving up on wisdom. It means trusting a deeper form of wisdom, one that emerges from awareness rather than control. Action still happens, learning still happens, but it is no longer driven by panic or self-doubt. There is also freedom in realizing that some questions are not meant to be answered in words. They are meant to be lived. Questions about meaning, purpose, and identity often change as we change. Any answer you find today may no longer fit tomorrow. When you allow questions to remain open, you allow yourself to evolve without constantly updating your conclusions. This practice also changes how you relate to others. When you stop demanding clarity from life, you stop demanding it from people. You become more patient with differences, ambiguity, and emotional complexity. You listen more deeply, not to respond with answers, but to understand experience. Relationships become less about fixing and more about presence. In meditation, this skill becomes very clear. Thoughts arise asking for explanations. Sensations appear without meaning. Emotions surface without stories. The practice is not to analyze them, but to notice them. to feel them directly, to allow them to come and go without attaching conclusions. Over time, this trains the mind to rest in awareness itself, not in the narratives it produces. There is a quiet courage required for this. The mind wants certainty because certainty feels safe. Letting questions remain unanswered can feel like stepping into open space. At first, this can be uncomfortable, but slowly, that discomfort reveals itself as openness, as flexibility, as a freedom that does not depend on mental closure. Wisdom deepens here because it is no longer limited by language. It becomes embodied. You do not just understand impermanence as an idea, you feel it. You do not just believe that control is limited, you experience the relief of letting go. This kind of knowing cannot be rushed. It grows through patience with the unfinished. As this understanding settles, you may notice a shift in how you meet life's uncertainties. The future does not need to be solved before it arrives. The past does not need to be fully explained before it can be released. The present does not need to make sense before it can be lived. This is not resignation. It is intimacy with reality as it is. Leaving questions unanswered becomes a form of trust. Not blind trust in outcomes, but trust in your ability to meet whatever arises. You begin to sense that you do not need complete understanding to be whole. You do not need final answers to be at peace. Life can remain unfinished, and you can remain present within it. This is where acceptance moves from concept to experience, not as a passive stance, but as a steady openness to what cannot yet be known. In this openness, wisdom grows quietly, without pressure, without force. And in that quiet growth, something unexpected appears, a sense of ease that does not depend on certainty, a calm that does not require resolution, a freedom that comes not from answers, but from the courage to live without demanding them. As the pressure to answer every question begins to loosen, another pattern quietly reveals itself. It is more subtle than fear of uncertainty, yet more exhausting. It is the constant urge to finish, to close, to resolve, to seal life into something neat and manageable. Even when answers are no longer demanded, the mind still searches for an ending, and this is where a deeper tension lives. There is a restlessness that comes not from confusion, but from the inability to leave anything open. A discomfort that arises when conversations trail off without resolution, when emotions linger without explanation, when situations remain unclear. This discomfort often disguises itself as responsibility, maturity, or strength. But underneath it lies something else entirely, a quiet form of inner violence. From a young age, completion is praised. Tasks must be finished. Stories must have endings, feelings must be processed, goals must be achieved. Closure is presented as healing, progress, and success. Over time, the mind absorbs a powerful message. Unfinished equals wrong, open equals unsafe, incomplete equals failure, and so begins what can be called completion addiction. Completion addiction is not the desire to grow or move forward. It is the compulsion to force finality where life naturally resists it. It is the belief that peace will arrive once everything is wrapped up, understood, forgiven, decided, and settled. This belief quietly drives much of our behavior, often without awareness. When completion becomes an obsession, the mind turns aggressive, not outwardly but inwardly. It pushes emotions to resolve faster than they can. It demands healing before wounds have softened. It rushes grief, silences confusion, and labels ambiguity as weakness. The inner world becomes a project to manage rather than a reality to listen to. This aggression is subtle, which is why it often goes unnoticed. It shows up as self-criticism for still feeling pain, as frustration for not being over it yet, as impatience with uncertainty, as pressure to define oneself clearly and permanently. None of this feels violent on the surface, but the body knows otherwise. tension accumulates. The nervous system stays activated. The mind remains on edge. Buddhist teachings recognize this pattern clearly. They point out that suffering does not only arise from pain, but from resistance to pain's natural rhythm. When we try to close what needs time, we create friction. When we force conclusions, we disconnect from the living process of experience. Reality is not something that ends neatly. It unfolds continuously, without final punctuation. Completion addiction also affects how we relate to others. When we need closure, we pressure people to explain themselves, to apologize fully, to change quickly, to provide reassurance. We listen not to understand, but to conclude. Conversations become negotiations for resolution rather than spaces for connection. When others cannot offer closure, irritation grows. Distance forms. Subtle resentment appears. This is not because people are difficult, but because life itself does not operate on our timelines. When we expect it to, we begin to treat reality as an obstacle rather than a partner. This creates a quiet hostility toward the way things are. Buddhism would call this a form of aversion, one of the root causes of suffering. There is also violence in how completion addiction treats time. It pulls attention constantly toward the future, toward the moment when things will finally be done. Peace becomes postponed. Presence becomes secondary. The now is tolerated only as a step toward resolution. Life becomes a series of waiting rooms, each one endured in the hope of arriving somewhere else. In this state, even joy becomes conditional. Happiness is allowed only after tasks are finished, problems are solved, and clarity is achieved. Until then, the nervous system remains on alert. This is exhausting. Not because life is demanding, but because the mind refuses to rest until it feels complete. Buddhism offers a radical alternative. It suggests that the need for closure is not wisdom, but craving. A craving for certainty, control, and psychological safety. Like all cravings, it promises relief but delivers tension. The more we satisfy it, the stronger it becomes. Each completed cycle creates the expectation that the next one must also be closed perfectly. Letting go of this addiction does not mean abandoning responsibility or effort. It means releasing the belief that everything must end cleanly in order to be okay. It means allowing experiences to trail off without forcing meaning onto them. It means recognizing that many parts of life remain open by nature, not by mistake. Grief is a clear example. Loss does not conclude, it changes shape. Attempts to find closure often turn grief into something to overcome rather than something to integrate. This creates self-judgment when sadness returns. But Buddhism teaches that grief is not meant to end completely. It is meant to soften, to coexist, to become part of the wider emotional landscape. Forcing closure only tightens it. The same is true for identity. Many people feel pressure to figure themselves out, to arrive at a final definition of who they are. This pressure creates anxiety and rigidity. When identity is treated as something that must be completed, growth feels threatening. Change feels like failure. Buddhism sees identity as fluid, conditioned, and impermanent. Trying to finalize it creates inner conflict. Completion addiction also shows up in spiritual practice itself. The mind turns awakening into a finish line. Meditation becomes a tool to achieve calm permanently. Insight becomes something to acquire and hold. When peace fades, frustration appears. This turns the path into another project, another demand for resolution. Buddhist teachings gently warn against this. They emphasize practice over attainment, presence over progress. The path is not something that ends, it is something that deepens. When the mind stops trying to arrive, practice becomes lighter, less aggressive, more sincere. Inner violence softens when completion is no longer required. The nervous system relaxes when it realizes it does not need to constantly monitor for endings. Emotions are allowed to move at their own pace. Thoughts are allowed to rise and fall without conclusion. Life becomes less of a problem to solve and more of a process to participate in. This shift also changes how mistakes are experienced. When everything must be completed perfectly, mistakes feel dangerous. They threaten the sense of progress. But when life is allowed to remain unfinished, mistakes become part of the movement. They do not need to be erased or redeemed immediately. They can simply be learned from, slowly and honestly. There is also humility in releasing the need for closure. It acknowledges the limits of understanding. It admits that not everything is meant to be resolved within one lifetime, one conversation, or one insight. This humility reduces arrogance toward reality. It replaces control with cooperation. Buddhism teaches that clinging creates suffering. Completion addiction is a refined form of clinging. It clings not to objects, but to endings. It clings to the belief that once something is done, peace will follow. Seeing this clearly is liberating because it reveals that peace has been postponed unnecessarily. When the need to finish loosens, something surprising happens. Attention returns to the present. The body relaxes. The mind becomes more spacious. There is less urgency to correct, fix, or finalize. This does not create chaos. It creates responsiveness. Action arises naturally when needed, not from panic, but from clarity. This does not mean that nothing ends. Some things do complete on their own. Projects conclude, relationships change, chapters close. The difference is that closure is allowed to happen organically, not forced. It becomes a natural event rather than a psychological demand. In this way, acceptance becomes an antidote to inner violence. It allows life to remain open without triggering resistance. It teaches the mind how to stay soft in the presence of the unfinished. And in that softness, a deeper strength emerges, one that does not need everything to be resolved in order to rest. As this understanding settles, the obsession with closure begins to lose its grip. Not through effort, but through insight. You begin to see that much of the pressure you carried was self-imposed. That life was never asking you to finish it, only to live it. And in releasing the need to complete, something else becomes possible. A gentler relationship with reality, a patience that does not depend on outcomes, a peace that does not wait for the final page. This prepares the ground for the next shift, where impermanence itself is no longer feared as loss, but recognized as the open draft that makes freedom possible. When the need to finish finally loosens, another fear often rises quietly to the surface. If nothing truly closes, if life is allowed to stay open, then what about time? What about change? What about the feeling that everything slips away? This is where impermanence enters the conversation, not as a threat, but as a misunderstood ally. There is a common belief that impermanence means loss, that everything beautiful will disappear, that stability is an illusion, that nothing can be trusted to last. Many people hear Buddhist teachings on impermanence and feel a subtle sadness, as if life is constantly being taken away piece by piece. But this view only comes from seeing impermanence as something final, something that ends things forever. Buddhism points to a very different understanding. Impermanence is not about things vanishing, it is about things remaining open. Life is not a completed story that slowly falls apart. It is an ongoing draft, always being edited, always being revised, always in motion. When impermanence is seen this way, it stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like relief. Because if nothing is fixed forever, then nothing has to be perfect. Nothing has to be finalized. Nothing has to be gotten right the first time. The pressure to get life right is one of the heaviest burdens people carry. It shows up as fear of making the wrong choice, anxiety about missed opportunities, regret about past decisions, worry about wasting time. All of this comes from treating life as if it were a final exam rather than a living process. Impermanence, when misunderstood, adds to this pressure. But when understood deeply, it dissolves it. Buddhism teaches that all conditioned things change. This includes emotions, relationships, identities, beliefs, and even suffering itself. But the key insight is not that things change. It is that they are never finished in the first place. Each moment flows into the next, shaped by countless causes and conditions. Nothing stands alone. Nothing reaches a final, unchangeable form. When you see life as perpetually editable, mistakes lose their power. A wrong turn is no longer a permanent mark. It becomes one version of a path that can still shift. Choices are not prisons, they are drafts. This does not mean actions have no consequences. It means consequences are not the end of the story. Many people suffer not because of what happened, but because they believe what happened defines them forever. Impermanence reveals that this belief is false. The self is not a finished product. It is a process. Thoughts change, values evolve, understanding deepens. Who you are today is not who you were before, and not who you will be later. This fluidity is not instability, it is freedom. Seeing impermanence as an ongoing draft also transforms how failure is experienced. Failure only feels devastating when life is treated as a final version. When everything is seen as editable, failure becomes information, not identity. It becomes part of the learning process rather than proof of inadequacy. This softens the inner dialogue and reduces self-punishment. This understanding also changes how success is held. Success is no longer something to cling to desperately. It is appreciated, enjoyed, and allowed to pass naturally. When success fades, it does not feel like the loss of self-worth. It feels like another phase in a larger movement. This prevents both arrogance and despair. Impermanence also reshapes how people relate to relationships. When relationships are seen as fixed structures that must last unchanged, fear enters quickly. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of abandonment. But when relationships are seen as living drafts, there is more honesty and care. Each interaction is valued without the demand that it remain the same forever. This does not make love weaker. It makes it more present. You stop trying to freeze moments. You start meeting them fully. You stop demanding guarantees. You start offering attention. Impermanence teaches how to love without ownership, how to connect without control. The pressure to get it right often comes from comparing life to an ideal version that exists only in the mind. Impermanence dissolves this comparison by reminding you that no version is final. There is no perfect snapshot to reach. There is only movement. This removes the urgency to constantly evaluate yourself against an imagined endpoint. Buddhist practice encourages direct observation of change. Watching sensations arise and pass, noticing thoughts come and go, feeling emotions shift without intervention. This observation builds trust in change itself. You begin to see that you do not need to manage everything for life to continue. Change happens on its own, intelligently and naturally. This trust reduces fear. When you trust change, you stop clinging to what feels safe. You stop resisting what feels unfamiliar. You become more adaptable, more resilient. Life no longer feels like something that can break if handled incorrectly. It feels like something that responds and reshapes itself continuously. Impermanence also heals regret. Regret assumes that the past could have been fixed permanently, that one decision ruined everything. But when the past is seen as part of an ongoing draft, regret softens. The past is no longer a closed door. Its effects continue to unfold, but they do not lock the future into one shape. New conditions arise, new responses become possible. This does not erase responsibility, it deepens it. You become responsible not for being perfect, but for being responsive, for learning, for adjusting, for staying awake to the present moment instead of fighting old versions of it. There is also a deep kindness in this view, toward yourself and toward others. When people change, disappoint, or contradict themselves, impermanence explains this without blame. It reminds you that everyone is in motion, that inconsistency is not always dishonesty. It is often growth in progress. Impermanence as an ongoing draft also transforms spiritual practice. Practice is no longer about reaching a final state of enlightenment that never fluctuates. It becomes a way of relating skillfully to constant change. Peace is not something that replaces movement. It is something that moves with it. This removes the pressure to be spiritually correct, to always be calm, to never react, to never struggle. Impermanence allows practice to include difficulty without seeing it as failure. Some days are clearer, some days are not. Both are part of the draft. When this understanding settles, patience grows naturally. You stop rushing yourself, you stop rushing life. You recognize that growth happens in layers, not leaps. That insight arrives gradually, often after confusion, not instead of it. Impermanence also reshapes how time is experienced. Time is no longer something slipping away. It becomes something unfolding. Each moment adds texture to the draft. Nothing is wasted. Even pauses, delays, and detours contribute to the whole. This perspective is especially healing for those who feel behind in life, behind in success, behind in relationships, behind in understanding. Impermanence reveals that there is no final schedule, no correct pace, no universal timeline. Everyone's draft unfolds differently. The fear of getting life wrong loses its grip when there is no final version to ruin. You are allowed to revise, to grow, to change direction, to soften your views, to mature slowly. This permission reduces anxiety and opens creativity. Impermanence does not mean nothing matters. It means everything matters in a different way, not because it lasts forever, but because it participates in a living process. Meaning is not stored in permanence. It is created through engagement. This also brings a new relationship with death. Death is no longer seen only as an ending, but as part of the same movement that includes birth, growth, decay, and transformation. While grief remains real, the panic around finality softens. Life is seen as continuous change rather than abrupt disappearance. When life is understood as perpetually editable, you stop demanding certainty from it. You stop demanding perfection from yourself. You stop treating mistakes as verdicts. You begin to cooperate with change rather than resisting it. This cooperation feels lighter, less defensive, more open. You become less afraid of not knowing what comes next, because whatever comes next will also be part of the draft. Adjustable, responsive, alive. As this view deepens, acceptance becomes more natural, not as resignation, but as flexibility. You accept not because you give up, but because you understand that nothing is finished enough to fight against. This prepares the mind for an even subtler insight. If life is always in motion, always revising itself, then what happens when the self tries to impose deadlines on it? What happens when the ego demands timing, certainty, and completion from something that has none? This is where another layer of suffering reveals itself, waiting to be seen. As life begins to feel more fluid and less fixed, another tension quietly comes into focus. Even when change is accepted and impermanence is understood, something inside still keeps checking the clock. Something keeps asking when this will end, when that will heal, when peace will finally arrive. This is not life speaking. This is the ego setting deadlines. There is a part of the mind that lives by timelines. It measures progress, compares speed, tracks improvement, and calculates how long something should take. This part believes that experiences must unfold according to a schedule in order to be valid. When they do not, frustration appears. Anxiety grows, doubt creeps in. The ego begins to feel threatened, not because something is wrong, but because something is taking too long. Reality, however, does not operate on deadlines. It does not hurry grief. It does not rush understanding. It does not speed up healing to match expectations. Experiences unfold according to conditions, not calendars. When the ego imposes time limits on experiences that have none, suffering arises. This suffering is subtle at first. It sounds like impatience. Thoughts such as, "I should be over this by now," or "I thought I would feel better by now," seem harmless, even reasonable. But underneath them lies a deeper message. Something is wrong with me because this has not ended yet. This belief creates pressure, and pressure turns experience into a problem. Buddhist teachings point out that much of our distress comes not from pain itself, but from our relationship with time. We are taught to believe that emotions should follow a predictable arc, that healing has stages with expected durations, that growth can be measured and completed. When reality does not cooperate, the ego interprets this as failure. The ego's need for deadlines comes from its desire for control. If it can predict when something will end, it feels safe. If it can assign a timeline, it feels competent. But life does not offer such guarantees. Change happens unevenly. Some wounds heal slowly. Some insights take years to mature. Some questions never resolve fully. When the ego cannot accept this, it turns against the experience itself. This inner conflict creates a second layer of suffering. The first layer may be sadness, fear, or confusion. The second layer is resistance to the fact that these states are still present. The ego says, "This should not still be happening." That resistance intensifies the original pain. What could have moved naturally becomes stuck under pressure. Timelines also distort how we see progress. The ego measures progress by distance from a starting point to an imagined endpoint. But many inner processes do not move in straight lines. Healing may circle back. Understanding may deepen through repetition. Growth may appear invisible for long periods before revealing itself. When progress is judged by speed rather than depth, its value is missed. Reality's timelessness does not mean nothing changes. It means change does not obey personal schedules. Buddhism teaches that experiences arise and pass based on causes and conditions. These conditions include biology, environment, history, and countless subtle influences. No single will can override them. When the ego tries to force timing, it ignores this complexity. This is especially clear with emotional pain. Grief, for example, has no deadline. It moves in waves. It resurfaces unexpectedly. Attempts to rush it often prolong it. When grief is allowed to unfold without time pressure, it softens gradually. When it is forced to end, it hardens into unresolved sorrow. The same is true for forgiveness. Forgiveness cannot be scheduled. It grows through understanding, safety, and emotional readiness. When the ego demands forgiveness by a certain time, resentment often deepens. Buddhism teaches that letting go happens when conditions are right, not when demanded. Timelines also affect how we relate to our spiritual path. Many people unconsciously set deadlines for awakening, peace, or mastery. They expect meditation to calm the mind within weeks. They expect insight to eliminate reactivity permanently. When this does not happen, discouragement sets in. The ego feels cheated. Buddhist practice emphasizes patience not as virtue signaling, but as realism. It recognizes that transformation happens in its own rhythm. Forcing progress turns practice into another source of tension. Letting practice unfold allows it to integrate naturally into life. The ego's deadlines also shape identity. People often believe they should have figured themselves out by a certain age. They feel behind if they have not found clarity in career, relationships, or purpose. This comparison is rooted in imagined timelines borrowed from culture, family, or social expectations. Reality does not recognize these milestones. When identity is measured against time, shame appears. People feel late to their own lives. This shame creates urgency, and urgency leads to rushed decisions. Buddhism invites a different view. Identity is seen as evolving, responsive, and never complete. There is no moment when the self must be finalized. Reality's timelessness also changes how the present moment is experienced. When the ego is focused on deadlines, the present is treated as a means to an end. It is valued only for how quickly it leads somewhere else. This creates chronic dissatisfaction. Even pleasant moments feel incomplete if they do not signal progress. When time pressure loosens, the present regains its depth. Experiences are no longer rushed through. Attention settles. Life feels fuller, not because it lasts longer, but because it is actually inhabited. Buddhism does not deny the practical usefulness of time. Schedules exist, responsibilities matter, but it distinguishes between functional time and psychological time. Functional time helps organize activity. Psychological time creates suffering when it is used to judge inner experience. The problem is not planning. The problem is expecting emotions, insights, and healing to obey plans. When this expectation is dropped, inner life becomes less adversarial. You stop arguing with your own pace. You stop comparing your timing to others. You stop measuring worth by speed. Reality's timelessness also reveals something profound about patience. Patience is not waiting passively for things to change. It is staying present without demanding change. It is allowing experiences to be as they are without adding urgency. This kind of patience is active. It requires awareness and trust. As patience deepens, anxiety decreases. Anxiety often comes from the belief that something must resolve soon or something bad will happen. When you stop imposing deadlines, the future loosens its grip. You become more responsive and less reactive. This shift also improves decision-making. When decisions are rushed by internal timelines, they are often driven by fear. When time pressure eases, clarity improves. Choices are made from understanding rather than urgency. The ego resists this because it equates timelessness with loss of control. But what is actually lost is illusion. Control over timing was never real. Releasing it does not weaken you. It strengthens adaptability. Timelessness also reframes waiting. Waiting is no longer seen as wasted time. It becomes part of the process. Rest becomes legitimate. Pauses become meaningful. Silence becomes informative. This changes how productivity is defined. Value is no longer tied only to output. There is also a deep compassion in recognizing timelessness. When you see that experiences unfold in their own time, you become gentler with yourself. You stop shaming yourself for not being there yet. You stop treating growth as a race. This compassion extends outward. You become more patient with others. You stop expecting people to change on your schedule. You listen more. You allow relationships to evolve without pressure. Buddhism teaches that suffering ends not when conditions are perfect, but when resistance ends. Deadlines are a form of resistance. They say, this moment is not acceptable unless it leads somewhere else. Timelessness says, this moment is allowed to exist as it is. When this understanding settles, something inside relaxes deeply. The nervous system no longer feels chased by the clock. The mind no longer feels behind. Life regains a sense of spaciousness. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop rushing care. You stop trying to arrive at peace. You begin to recognize that peace does not live at the end of a timeline. It lives in how you relate to time itself. As this insight deepens, another subtle habit becomes visible. Even when deadlines dissolve, there can still be an urge to force healing, to close wounds quickly, to seal pain before it has finished speaking. This reveals yet another layer of inner pressure, waiting to be understood. As the grip of deadlines loosens and the pressure of time begins to fade, attention naturally turns inward. Not toward answers or progress, but toward the places that still ache. Even without timelines, even without urgency, there are wounds that remain sensitive. And here, another habit quietly reveals itself: the habit of trying to heal too quickly. There is a discomfort that comes from pain being present without resolution. The mind wants relief, not just from suffering, but from the uncertainty of how long suffering will last. This is where healing becomes something to achieve rather than something to allow, and in that shift, pain often deepens instead of dissolving. Healing is often spoken about as a process with stages, milestones, and outcomes. You are expected to grieve, then accept, then move on. You are encouraged to process emotions, find meaning, and close the chapter. While these ideas are meant to support recovery, they can quietly turn into pressure. Pressure to be better. Pressure to stop feeling what you feel. Pressure to prove that you are healing correctly. Buddhist teachings approach healing from a very different angle. They do not see wounds as problems to be closed, but as experiences to be met with awareness. Healing is not something you do to pain. It is something that happens when pain is allowed to exist without resistance. When healing is forced, it becomes another form of control. The mind decides that pain has overstayed its welcome. It labels emotions as unhealthy or unproductive. It searches for techniques to eliminate discomfort rather than understand it. This creates a quiet conflict between what is happening and what should be happening. This conflict is where prolonged suffering begins. Pain itself has a natural movement. It rises, falls, shifts, and changes form. When it is allowed to breathe, it gradually integrates into the wider emotional system. But when it is rushed, it tightens, it becomes guarded, it settles deeper into the body and mind. Forcing healing often shows up as positive thinking, telling yourself you should be grateful, reminding yourself that others have it worse, trying to reframe pain before it has been felt. While these strategies may seem helpful, they can bypass the actual experience. Pain that is bypassed does not disappear. It waits. Buddhism teaches that awareness is the ground of healing. Awareness does not rush, it does not judge, it does not demand improvement, it simply stays. When awareness meets pain, pain is no longer isolated. It is held within a larger field of presence. This holding is what allows healing to unfold organically. Organic healing is not neat. It does not follow a straight line. It may look like progress one day and regression the next. Emotions may resurface unexpectedly. Memories may return without warning. This does not mean healing has failed. It means healing is alive. Many people believe that if pain returns, something went wrong. Buddhism challenges this belief. It suggests that healing is not about eliminating pain completely, but about changing your relationship to it. When pain arises and is met without fear, it loses its authority. It becomes a sensation, not a threat. Letting wounds breathe means allowing pain to be present without trying to close it prematurely. This does not mean dwelling in suffering. It means not interfering with its natural rhythm. Just as a physical wound needs air to heal, emotional wounds need space. They need honesty. They need time. When wounds are sealed too quickly, they can trap infection. Emotionally, this looks like unresolved grief, chronic resentment, or persistent anxiety. The surface may appear healed, but underneath there is tension. The body remembers what the mind tried to forget. Buddhist practice encourages gentle attention to pain, not analysis, not fixing, simply noticing, feeling where pain lives in the body, observing its texture, its movement, its intensity. This kind of attention is non-invasive. It does not try to change the experience. It allows the experience to change itself. This approach requires trust. Trust that pain has its own intelligence. Trust that emotions are not enemies. Trust that the mind does not need to manage every sensation. This trust grows slowly, through repeated experiences of staying present without collapsing or escaping. Unfinished healing also challenges the idea that there is a final healed version of the self. Many people carry an image of who they will be once they are healed. Calm, confident, unaffected. Buddhism does not promise this version. It points to something more realistic and more compassionate. Healing does not erase sensitivity. It refines it. It does not remove vulnerability. It integrates it. A healed person is not someone who never hurts. It is someone who can feel hurt without being overwhelmed by it. This understanding removes the shame around ongoing pain. You stop asking why you are still affected. You stop measuring yourself against an ideal. You stop turning healing into a performance. Instead, you allow yourself to be where you are. There is also a deep kindness in allowing wounds to remain open as long as they need. It means you stop abandoning yourself when things get uncomfortable. You stop rushing past your own experience. You stay. Staying with pain does not mean identifying with it. Buddhism emphasizes the difference between experiencing pain and becoming pain. Awareness allows pain to arise within a larger context. You are not your wound. You are the space in which the wound appears. This distinction is crucial. When pain is allowed to exist without being labeled as the self, it becomes less heavy. It still hurts, but it no longer defines identity. This creates room for movement, for change, for softening. Unfinished healing also affects how you relate to others. When you allow your own wounds to breathe, you become more patient with others' pain. You stop expecting people to heal on your timeline. You stop demanding emotional readiness. You meet people where they are. This reduces conflict. Much conflict arises from trying to close emotional gaps too quickly, forcing apologies, demanding forgiveness, expecting clarity before it is available. When healing is allowed to remain unfinished, relationships become more honest, more spacious. Buddhism also recognizes that some wounds are collective. Trauma does not exist only at the individual level. Cultural, historical, and relational wounds shape experience. Expecting complete personal healing without acknowledging these layers creates unrealistic expectations. Acceptance allows healing to be contextual, not isolated. There is also wisdom in recognizing that some pain does not need to be healed in the way we think. Some pain transforms into compassion. Some loss deepens sensitivity. Some wounds become sources of understanding. Healing does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means integration. When you stop forcing healing, something subtle changes in the nervous system. The constant monitoring for improvement relaxes. The body feels safer. Safety allows regulation. Regulation allows healing. This is not theory, it is observable in experience. Acceptance creates the conditions for organic recovery, not because it tries to heal, but because it removes the obstacles to healing. Resistance is one of those obstacles. Judgment is another. Impatience is another. Acceptance clears the space. This does not mean you stop seeking support. Therapy, reflection, and community all have value. The difference is intention. Support becomes a way of understanding, not a way of erasing. It becomes accompaniment, not correction. Unfinished healing also reframes setbacks. When pain resurfaces, it is not seen as failure. It is seen as another layer becoming visible. Healing is layered. What you could not feel before may now be ready to be felt. This is progress, not regression. There is also humility in this view. It accepts that some wounds may never fully close, that some losses will always be felt. Buddhism does not see this as tragic. It sees it as part of being human. Trying to eliminate all pain is not liberation. Learning how to live with pain wisely is. As you allow wounds to breathe, you may notice a surprising outcome. Pain becomes less dramatic, less overwhelming. It still exists, but it no longer demands all your attention. Life continues alongside it. Joy and pain coexist. This coexistence is a sign of maturity, not resignation. It means you are no longer organizing your life around avoiding pain. You are living fully with everything included. This prepares the ground for another insight. If healing does not need to be finished, if wounds can remain open without defining us, then what about readiness itself? What if we do not need to be prepared, resolved, or complete in order to deserve peace? This question opens the door to a deeper form of acceptance, one that allows even unpreparedness to belong. As wounds are allowed to stay open without being rushed, another quiet belief begins to loosen. The belief that peace must wait until healing is complete, until strength is restored, until confidence returns. And when this belief softens, something unexpected becomes possible. Peace without readiness. There is a deep pressure in modern life to be prepared. Prepared emotionally, prepared mentally, prepared spiritually. People often feel they must reach a certain level of stability before they are allowed to rest, before they are allowed to feel calm, before they are allowed to trust life again. This creates a subtle hierarchy inside the mind, where some versions of the self are worthy of peace and others are not. Buddhist acceptance dissolves this hierarchy. It does not ask whether you are ready. It does not require completion, clarity, or strength. It recognizes that peace is not a reward for preparedness. It is a quality of awareness that can exist even in uncertainty, even in weakness, even in confusion. Not being ready is one of the most uncomfortable states a human being can experience. It feels exposed, vulnerable, unsafe. The mind interprets unpreparedness as danger. It assumes that something bad will happen if readiness is not achieved quickly. This assumption fuels anxiety and self-pressure. Much of this pressure comes from identifying peace with control. We believe we will be at peace once we know what to do, once we feel capable, once we feel confident. Buddhism challenges this belief by pointing out that control is always partial. No amount of preparation can fully secure the future. Waiting to be ready becomes an endless delay. The peace of not being ready begins when this delay is questioned. When you notice how often you postpone rest, kindness, and acceptance until some internal checklist is completed, you may realize that the checklist keeps growing. That readiness always seems just out of reach. Buddhist teachings suggest a radical shift. Instead of asking, "Am I ready for peace?" they ask, "Can peace include this unpreparedness?" This question changes everything. It removes peace from the future and brings it into the present exactly as it is. This does not mean ignoring responsibility or avoiding growth. It means recognizing that growth does not require withholding peace. In fact, growth often happens more easily when pressure is removed. When the nervous system is allowed to settle, learning becomes possible. Unpreparedness often carries shame. People feel embarrassed for not knowing, for not having answers, for not being confident. This shame creates inner tension. Buddhism treats this tension gently. It sees unpreparedness not as a flaw, but as a natural state of learning and becoming. The Buddha himself emphasized beginner's mind, a mind that does not assume mastery, a mind that remains open. Beginner's mind is unprepared by definition, yet it is the most receptive state. When you allow yourself to be unprepared, curiosity replaces fear. Openness replaces defense. The peace that comes from this openness is quiet. It is not excitement or certainty. It is a sense of permission, permission to pause, permission to not know, permission to be in process without apology. Many people fear that if they accept being unprepared, they will become passive or irresponsible. Buddhism does not support this fear. Acceptance is not resignation. It is honesty. It acknowledges the current state without distortion. From this honesty, appropriate action can arise. When you stop fighting unpreparedness, you stop wasting energy on pretending. You stop performing readiness for yourself or others. This frees attention. It allows you to respond authentically rather than react defensively. Not being ready is especially common during transitions, loss, change, new beginnings. These moments naturally disrupt confidence. Trying to force readiness during transitions often increases suffering. Acceptance allows transitions to unfold without added pressure. There is also a deep kindness in allowing yourself to be unprepared. It means you stop abandoning yourself when you feel uncertain. You stay present with your own vulnerability. This builds trust. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in your capacity to meet what arises. Buddhist acceptance teaches that worthiness is not conditional. You do not earn peace by fixing yourself. You are not disqualified from calm because you are confused. Awareness does not judge readiness, it simply includes. This inclusion is transformative. When unpreparedness is allowed, it loses its threat. The body relaxes, the mind softens. You may still not know what to do next, but you are no longer at war with that not knowing. The peace of not being ready also changes how you relate to others. You become less defensive about your limitations, less reactive when you feel exposed, more honest about uncertainty. This honesty creates genuine connection. In relationships, pretending to be ready often creates distance. Admitting unpreparedness creates trust. It invites collaboration instead of competition. Buddhism values this humility. It sees it as strength, not weakness. Not being ready also frees creativity. Creativity thrives in openness, not in certainty. When you allow yourself to be unfinished, new possibilities appear, ideas emerge, directions shift. Readiness often follows exploration, not the other way around. This perspective also softens fear of the future. Much fear comes from believing you must be ready for everything that might happen. Buddhism teaches that this is impossible. Life will always present situations beyond preparation. Peace comes not from readiness, but from presence. Presence does not require confidence. It requires attention. You can be present while unsure. You can be present while afraid. You can be present while learning. Presence is available immediately. This is why peace does not need to wait. There is also relief in recognizing that many of the standards for readiness are external. Cultural expectations, social comparisons, imagined timelines. When you stop measuring yourself against these standards, pressure eases. You return to your own pace. Buddhist practice supports this return through mindfulness. Mindfulness does not ask if you are ready to observe. It invites observation as you are. Thoughts, emotions, and sensations are noticed without evaluation. This practice builds familiarity with unpreparedness. Over time, it becomes less threatening. As familiarity grows, trust grows. You trust that you can stay with discomfort without collapsing. You trust that you can learn as you go. You trust that peace does not abandon you when certainty disappears. The peace of not being ready also reframes mistakes. Mistakes are no longer signs of incompetence. They are natural outcomes of learning. When readiness is not required, mistakes lose their sting. They become feedback, not verdicts. This does not mean celebrating harm or carelessness. It means removing moral judgment from imperfection. Buddhism separates action from identity. You are not your readiness level. You are not your confidence. You are awareness itself. When this understanding settles, self-compassion becomes natural. You stop pushing yourself to be someone else before you are allowed to rest. You stop delaying peace. You allow yourself to arrive exactly as you are. This arrival is not dramatic. It is subtle, a quiet easing, a softening of effort. You may still feel unsure, you may still feel incomplete, but underneath those feelings there is steadiness. This steadiness is not based on preparedness. It is based on acceptance. Acceptance does not remove challenges. It removes unnecessary struggle. It allows life to unfold without constant self-correction. As you begin to rest in this permission, another subtle habit becomes visible. Even when you accept unpreparedness, there may still be a longing for resolution, a desire for answers, a craving for guarantees. This longing often disguises itself as desire, and understanding this disguise opens the next layer of insight. As the permission to remain unprepared begins to feel safer, something subtle starts to surface beneath it. Even without pressure, even without deadlines, there is often a quiet pull toward resolution. A feeling that something still needs to settle. A sense that peace would deepen if only one more thing were clear. This pull feels reasonable, even wise, but this is where desire hides in plain sight. Desire is usually described as wanting pleasure, success, or comfort, but in its more refined form, desire does not chase objects. It chases certainty. It wants the story to end. It wants the feeling to resolve. It wants assurance that things will turn out okay. And when it appears in this form, it often disguises itself as the need for answers. The mind says it just wants understanding. It just wants closure. It just wants to know what will happen next. But underneath these requests is craving. Not craving for things, but craving for relief from uncertainty. Buddhism identifies this craving as one of the deepest sources of suffering, precisely because it looks so reasonable. When desire pretends to be resolution, it feels urgent but justified. You may tell yourself that once you understand why something happened, you will be at peace, or that once a situation reaches a clear outcome, you can finally relax, or that once you receive reassurance, the anxiety will stop. These beliefs are compelling because they contain a partial truth. Clarity can bring relief, but when clarity becomes a requirement for peace, it becomes a trap. Craving always promises satisfaction just beyond the current moment. It says peace is coming, but not now. It directs attention away from present experience toward a future state where things will finally settle. This postponement creates restlessness. Even when conditions are good, the mind remains slightly dissatisfied, waiting for resolution. Buddhist teachings point out that craving is not the same as preference. Preference is flexible. It allows things to be as they are while leaning toward improvement. Craving is rigid. It demands change. When craving disguises itself as resolution, it demands that uncertainty end before acceptance is allowed. This demand turns experience into a problem. Emotions are no longer simply felt. They are evaluated based on how close they are to resolving. Thoughts are no longer observed. They are interrogated for answers. Life becomes something to manage rather than something to inhabit. One of the most common ways this appears is through overthinking. Overthinking is not curiosity. It is craving for certainty expressed through mental activity. The mind repeats questions not because new insight is emerging, but because it cannot tolerate not knowing. Each thought promises resolution. Each thought fails to deliver it. The cycle continues. This cycle is exhausting because it never reaches completion. Craving cannot be satisfied by answers because its discomfort does not come from lack of information. It comes from resistance to uncertainty. No amount of explanation can resolve that resistance. Only acceptance can. Desire also disguises itself as the need for outcomes. The mind says it cannot rest until a situation turns out a certain way. It waits for results, approval, success, confirmation. This waiting creates tension. The present moment is treated as incomplete until the outcome arrives. When the outcome does arrive, relief may come briefly, but it fades quickly because craving immediately attaches to the next uncertainty. This reveals an important truth. Resolution does not end craving. It feeds it. Each resolution strengthens the belief that peace depends on the next one. Buddhism teaches that craving is not wrong. It is natural, but when it is unconscious, it controls behavior. When it is seen clearly, it loosens its grip. The key is recognizing when desire is operating under the name of resolution. Guarantees are another disguise. The mind wants certainty about the future. It wants assurance that pain will not return, that effort will be rewarded. that choices will not lead to regret. This desire for guarantees is understandable, but life does not offer them. When the mind insists on guarantees, it becomes anxious. It scans constantly for signs of safety. It tries to predict outcomes. It rehearses scenarios. This vigilance creates stress, not because danger is present, but because uncertainty is. Buddhist acceptance does not promise guarantees. It offers something more reliable, the ability to meet uncertainty without collapsing. This ability grows when craving is recognized and released. Letting go of craving does not mean giving up goals or preferences. It means letting go of the belief that peace depends on outcomes. It means allowing desires to exist without letting them dictate your inner state. This is especially important in relationships. Craving often shows up as the need for reassurance, commitment, or clarity from others. While communication is healthy, demanding resolution can create pressure. When others cannot provide certainty, frustration grows. Buddhism teaches that clinging to how people should respond creates suffering. When you notice craving for resolution in relationships, you can soften it by returning attention to presence, listening without needing answers, being with uncertainty without demanding control. Desire also pretends to be spiritual progress. The mind wants to know when it will be enlightened, when it will be free from suffering, when practice will pay off. This turns spirituality into another outcome-driven pursuit. Buddhist teachings consistently warn against this. They emphasize that awakening is not an end point. It is a way of relating. Craving for resolution turns practice into striving. Letting go of craving allows practice to deepen naturally. When craving is active, there is always a subtle dissatisfaction. Even pleasant moments feel incomplete. Even calm feels fragile. This is because craving keeps attention oriented toward what is missing. When craving relaxes, something shifts. The present moment becomes sufficient, not perfect, not permanent, but enough. This sufficiency is the ground of peace. Seeing desire clearly requires honesty. It requires noticing how often the mind says, just one more thing, one more answer, one more sign, one more guarantee. This noticing is not judgment, it is awareness. As awareness grows, craving loses its disguise. You see that the urge for resolution is not wisdom, it is discomfort seeking escape. This recognition creates space. In that space, acceptance can enter. Acceptance does not resolve uncertainty. It changes how uncertainty is held. Instead of being something to escape, uncertainty becomes something to coexist with. This coexistence reduces suffering more effectively than any answer. This does not mean life becomes passive or dull. It becomes responsive. Actions arise from clarity rather than urgency. Decisions are made without demanding certainty. Effort is applied without clinging to results. When desire no longer pretends to be resolution, the mind becomes quieter. Not because questions disappear, but because the need to answer them dissolves. This quiet is not emptiness, it is openness. In this openness, insight arises naturally, not as conclusions, but as understanding. Understanding that peace does not come from finishing life. It comes from stopping the chase. As this understanding settles, another space becomes visible. A pause between what happens and how the mind reacts. A space where nothing has resolved yet, and nothing needs to. Learning to dwell in this space reveals another dimension of acceptance, one that deepens not through answers, but through stillness. As the craving for resolution loosens its grip, something quieter becomes noticeable. A brief stillness. A moment where the mind does not rush forward or backward. A space that often goes unnoticed because it does not provide answers. This space is subtle, but it is where transformation begins. There is always a pause between what happens and how we respond to it. Most of the time, this pause is skipped. A feeling arises and reaction follows instantly. A thought appears and judgment arrives right behind it. Cause and effect seem glued together, inseparable, but they are not. Between them exists a gap. Buddhism treats this gap not as empty time, but as sacred ground. This pause is uncomfortable at first. It contains uncertainty. Nothing has resolved yet. No conclusion has been reached. The mind feels exposed here because it cannot hide behind explanations or decisions. This is why the pause is usually avoided. We rush to fill it with action, interpretation, or distraction. But when the urge to resolve begins to soften, the pause becomes accessible. And when it is entered consciously, it reveals a depth of experience that is otherwise missed. Insight does not arise in reaction, it matures in stillness. Cause and effect dominate how we understand life. We are taught to believe that every action produces a predictable outcome, that every emotion leads to a behavior, that every thought must result in a decision. While this framework is useful for functioning, it becomes limiting when applied to inner life. Inner experience does not always follow linear rules. Buddhist teachings emphasize dependent arising. Experiences arise due to conditions, not single causes. Between a stimulus and a response, countless factors are present: history, mood, sensation, memory, habit. The pause allows these layers to be noticed. When you dwell in the pause, you begin to see that reactions are not inevitable. They feel automatic only because they are habitual. The pause interrupts habit. It creates choice where there once was compulsion. This is why the pause feels powerful and frightening at the same time. It removes excuses. When you see the gap, you see that response is not forced. You see that awareness can intervene. This realization carries responsibility, but also freedom. The pause is not about suppressing reaction. It is about allowing experience to unfold without immediate interference. When a feeling arises, instead of acting on it or analyzing it, you stay. You feel the raw sensation, the warmth, the tightness, the movement. You notice how it shifts on its own. This noticing reveals an important truth. Many emotions resolve naturally when they are not pushed or pulled. The pause allows emotions to complete their cycle without being hijacked by stories. Stories collapse time. They jump from cause to conclusion instantly. The pause stretches time open. It returns experience to the present. This is why insight matures here. Insight requires space. It cannot arise when the mind is rushing to explain or fix. The sacredness of the pause does not come from spirituality or belief. It comes from its honesty. In the pause, there is no narrative yet. No identity is being defended. No outcome is being pursued. What remains is direct experience. This directness is often uncomfortable because it strips away mental protection. You may feel exposed, unsure, or vulnerable. But this vulnerability is not danger. It is sensitivity returning. Sensitivity allows nuance. Instead of labeling an experience as good or bad, you sense its complexity. Instead of reacting from habit, you respond from understanding. This is not intellectual understanding. It is embodied knowing. The pause also changes how time is felt. It slows internal momentum. Moments feel fuller, less rushed. You are no longer living only for what comes next. You are present for what is happening now. In Buddhist meditation, this pause is cultivated deliberately. Attention is placed on the breath, the body, or awareness itself. When a thought arises, it is noticed, not followed. When a sensation appears, it is felt, not interpreted. Each time this happens, the pause widens. This widening does not make life passive. It makes it precise. Actions taken from the pause are cleaner, less reactive, less regretful. They are aligned with reality rather than driven by fear. The pause is also where compassion grows. When you slow down between stimulus and response, you see the complexity of your own reactions. You recognize how much is conditioned. This recognition softens judgment toward yourself. And when judgment softens inwardly, it softens outwardly. In relationships, the pause prevents escalation. A comment is heard. Instead of reacting defensively, you pause. You feel the impulse to respond. You notice the tension. In that pause, understanding becomes possible. You may still respond, but from clarity rather than reflex. This does not mean silence is always required. Sometimes speaking is necessary. The difference is timing. Speaking from the pause carries less aggression. It is less about winning and more about expressing. The pause also reveals how much of suffering is self-generated, not by events, but by reactions to events. This is not blame, it is insight. When you see that reaction amplifies pain, you gain the option to soften that amplification. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises when craving and aversion dominate the mind. The pause is where craving and aversion are seen clearly. When they are seen, they lose some of their power. Dwelling in the pause does not eliminate desire or fear, it changes how they operate. Instead of driving behavior unconsciously, they become experiences that pass through awareness. This is why insight matures here. Insight is not an idea. It is a shift in perception. It happens when the mind sees directly how it creates suffering. This seeing cannot be rushed. It requires patience and stillness. The pause also changes how mistakes are experienced. When you act without pausing, mistakes feel overwhelming. When you pause, mistakes become learning moments. You see what happened. You adjust. There is less self-attack. Over time, the pause becomes familiar. It stops feeling empty and starts feeling supportive. You trust it. You return to it naturally. It becomes a refuge, and this refuge is always available. It does not depend on circumstances. Even in chaos, a brief pause can be found. Even in pain, a moment of awareness can arise. The pause is not about withdrawal. It is about presence. You are not stepping away from life. You are stepping into it more fully. As you dwell in this space, you may notice that many things resolve on their own, not because you forced them, but because you allowed them. And some things do not resolve. The pause teaches you how to live with that too. This is where wisdom deepens, not in answers, but in capacity, the capacity to stay, to listen, to respond wisely rather than react quickly. The sacred pause reveals that life does not need to be constantly managed. It unfolds intelligently when not obstructed by panic or control. Trust grows here. Trust not in outcomes, but in awareness. As the pause between cause and effect becomes more familiar, another quiet attachment begins to reveal itself. Even when reactions soften and presence deepens, the mind may still lean forward, still carrying an image of who it is supposed to become. A version of yourself that feels calmer, wiser, healed, and finally at ease. This image often feels motivating, even hopeful, but hidden inside it is another form of postponement. There is a common belief that peace lives in the future, that it arrives once you change enough, grow enough, understand enough. You may tell yourself that once you become more confident, more disciplined, more spiritual, or more emotionally stable, then life will feel right. Until then, the present feels like a waiting room, tolerable but not complete. This belief creates what can be called the future self-fantasy. It is the idea that the current version of you is not quite worthy of peace yet. That peace belongs to a more polished version of you, a version that does not struggle as much, a version that has learned the lessons and fixed the flaws. At first, this fantasy seems harmless. It can even feel inspiring, but over time, it quietly undermines acceptance. It turns growth into a condition for peace rather than an expression of it. And this creates subtle suffering. Buddhist teachings gently dismantle this illusion by pointing to a simple truth. There is no future self that will arrive and replace you. There is only ongoing experience. The self is not something you become. It is something that continuously unfolds. Waiting to become someone else before allowing peace is a misunderstanding of how life works. The future self fantasy is rooted in comparison. You compare who you are now with who you think you should be. That comparison creates tension. The present moment is judged as insufficient. The future is idealized. This split keeps you mentally divided. This division shows up as self-improvement pressure. You may feel constant low-level dissatisfaction even when things are going well. There is always something more to fix, something else to improve, something else to become. Peace keeps moving further away. Buddhism does not reject growth or learning. It rejects the belief that peace depends on completion. Growth happens naturally when conditions support it. But peace is not a finish line. It is a way of relating to what is happening now. The future self-fantasy also creates impatience. You want to get there quickly. You want results. You want proof that you are changing. When progress feels slow, frustration arises. You may feel discouraged or ashamed for not becoming the version you imagined fast enough. This impatience is painful because it keeps attention locked on what is missing. Even genuine progress can feel invisible when measured against an ideal. You may overlook how much you have already learned because you are focused on what remains undone. Another cost of the future self-fantasy is conditional self-acceptance. You accept yourself only when you are calm, only when you act wisely, only when you respond correctly. When you fall short, acceptance is withdrawn. This creates an unstable relationship with yourself. Buddhist acceptance offers a different foundation. It does not ask you to approve of every behavior or ignore harm. It asks you to include yourself fully in awareness, exactly as you are. From this inclusion, skillful change becomes possible. When acceptance is present, growth is no longer driven by self-rejection. It is driven by understanding. You learn because you are curious, not because you are ashamed. You change because it feels natural, not because you are trying to escape yourself. Letting go of the future self-fantasy does not mean abandoning aspirations. It means releasing the belief that your worth and peace depend on reaching them. You can still learn, practice, and evolve, but you no longer withhold kindness from yourself along the way. This shift changes how you experience difficulty. When challenges arise, you no longer see them as evidence that you are not who you should be. You see them as part of being human. This reduces inner conflict. The future self-fantasy also affects how you relate to time. It pulls attention forward constantly. You live mentally ahead of yourself, planning, anticipating, and evaluating who you will be. This makes it difficult to inhabit the present fully. When you let go of this fantasy, time relaxes. You stop living for a version of yourself that does not exist yet. You return to the immediacy of experience. Life becomes less about arriving and more about participating. Buddhism teaches that identity is not fixed. There is no permanent self that becomes complete. What you call yourself is a collection of habits, memories, sensations, and intentions that are constantly changing. The idea of a final version is a mental construction. Seeing this clearly is liberating. It removes the pressure to become someone else. You stop chasing an image. You start relating to what is actually happening. This does not make life stagnant. It makes it honest. You respond to what is real rather than striving for what is imagined. Letting go of the future self-fantasy also softens comparison with others. When peace is tied to becoming a certain type of person, others may appear ahead or behind. This creates envy or superiority. Both are forms of suffering. When peace is grounded in acceptance, comparison loses its grip. You recognize that everyone is unfolding differently. There is no universal endpoint, no correct version to reach. This perspective also changes how you view spiritual teachings. Teachings are no longer instructions for becoming a better self. They are invitations to see more clearly. Practice is not about self-upgrading, it is about self-understanding. Many people unconsciously use spirituality to reinforce the future self-fantasy. They imagine a version of themselves that is always calm, never reactive, and permanently centered. When reality does not match this image, disappointment follows. Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that even awakened beings experience emotions, sensations, and change. What shifts is not the disappearance of experience, but the relationship to it. Peace is not the absence of movement, it is ease within movement. Letting go of the future self-fantasy allows you to be more present with your actual life. Not the life you hope to have once you improve, but the life unfolding now. This presence brings richness and depth. It also brings humility. You stop assuming that becoming someone else will solve everything. You recognize that challenges will continue to arise, and that is okay. This humility is freeing. It removes the burden of perfection. You no longer need to get yourself right before living fully. As acceptance deepens, you may notice a subtle grief. The grief of realizing that the imagined future self was never coming, that the promise of final arrival was an illusion. This grief is natural. It marks the end of a long pursuit. But alongside this grief comes relief. Relief from constant self-monitoring, relief from postponement, relief from the belief that peace is always elsewhere. In this relief, something simple becomes clear. You do not need to become someone else to be at peace. You need to stop leaving yourself behind. Peace does not arrive when you change. Change arrives when peace is allowed. As the pull toward a future version of yourself begins to fade, attention naturally turns toward what has already been lived. Not to fix it, not to complete it, but simply because it is still there, quietly present, unfinished in ways that no future improvement can erase. There are moments from the past that do not close neatly, words that were never said, choices that were never explained, relationships that ended without clarity. These moments often remain active inside us, not as clear memories but as emotional echoes. They surface unexpectedly, carrying tension, regret, or longing. Many people believe peace requires resolving these memories, rewriting them, or pushing them away. Buddhism offers a different path. The past does not ask to be corrected, it asks to be included. Unfinished conversations with the past are not mistakes. They are natural outcomes of living in time. Life moves faster than understanding. People change before explanations arrive. Circumstances end before emotions settle. Expecting every experience to conclude cleanly is unrealistic. Yet the mind often resists this reality. This resistance shows up in two common strategies. One is suppression, trying not to think about the past, distracting yourself, avoiding reminders. The other is rewriting, replaying events mentally, imagining better outcomes, or assigning new meanings to make the past more acceptable. Both strategies seem protective, but both keep the past active. Suppression requires effort. The mind must constantly push memories away. This creates tension. What is pushed down often returns with more intensity because it has not been understood or integrated. Rewriting requires control. The mind tries to reshape what happened to reduce discomfort, but reality resists alteration. The past does not change, no matter how many times it is reimagined. Buddhist acceptance offers a third option, allowing the past to remain unresolved without trying to change it. This does not mean reliving it endlessly. It means letting memories exist as they are, without adding resistance or correction. This approach begins with recognizing that memories are not static records. They are experiences arising in the present. When a memory appears, it is happening now as a sensation, a feeling, a thought. By relating to it as a present experience, you shift out of the belief that the past is controlling you. Unresolved memories often carry emotion, sadness, anger, shame, longing. These emotions are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that something mattered. Buddhism does not treat these emotions as problems to eliminate. It treats them as experiences to be met with awareness. Meeting a memory with awareness means allowing it to arise without judgment, not analyzing it, not arguing with it, not trying to understand it fully, simply noticing what appears, the images, the feelings in the body, the tone of the mind. This gentle attention allows the memory to soften. Softening does not mean forgetting. It means the memory loses its sharp edges. It no longer demands resolution. It becomes part of the emotional landscape rather than a wound that keeps reopening. Many people fear that if they stop trying to resolve the past, they will become stuck in it. Buddhism suggests the opposite. It is resistance that keeps the past alive. Acceptance allows it to settle naturally. Unfinished conversations are especially painful because they involve relationship. We are social beings. When communication is cut short, the nervous system remains alert. It waits for closure. When closure does not arrive, the body holds tension. Acceptance does not force closure. It acknowledges that some conversations will never happen, some apologies will never be spoken, some explanations will never be given. This acknowledgement is painful, but it is also honest, and honesty creates relief. When you stop demanding resolution from the past, you stop reopening the wound. You allow grief to complete its own movement. Grief does not need answers. It needs space. Buddhist teachings emphasize that clinging creates suffering. Clinging to how the past should have gone is a form of attachment. It keeps the mind locked in comparison between what happened and what was hoped for. Letting go of this comparison allows the past to be seen more clearly. Seeing clearly does not mean approving. It means recognizing reality without distortion. The past happened as it did. This recognition is not resignation. It is grounding. Grounding yourself in what actually occurred allows you to relate to it without fantasy. You stop imagining alternative endings. You stop measuring yourself against different versions of history. You begin to live in the present again. Unresolved memories often shape identity. People define themselves by what happened to them. This can create rigidity. When acceptance enters, identity loosens. You are no longer only the one who experienced that event. You are also the one who is experiencing now. This shift creates space. The memory does not disappear, but it no longer defines the whole self. It becomes one thread in a larger story that is still unfolding. Buddhism also teaches impermanence in relation to memory. Memories change over time. Their emotional charge shifts. When you allow this change instead of resisting it, healing happens naturally. Forcing meaning onto the past often interrupts this natural change. When you decide what an event means too quickly, you freeze it. You lock it into a narrative. Acceptance allows meaning to evolve. This is especially important for painful experiences. What something means to you today may not be what it means later. Allowing this flexibility prevents stagnation. Living with unresolved memories also requires compassion. Compassion for yourself as you were, for what you knew at the time, for what you could not see. Buddhism emphasizes that actions arise from conditions. You did what you did based on what was available to you then. This understanding reduces self-blame. It does not excuse harm. It contextualizes it. You can take responsibility without attacking yourself. Acceptance also changes how you relate to others involved in the past. You stop waiting for them to change, apologize, or explain. This does not mean approving of what happened. It means releasing the expectation that they will resolve it for you. This release is freeing. It returns power to the present. You no longer depend on external closure. You develop internal steadiness. Unfinished conversations with the past can also become teachers. They reveal what you value, what hurts because it mattered, what you longed for. This information can guide how you live now. Buddhist practice encourages mindful reflection, not rumination. Reflection observes without drowning. It allows insight without obsession. When memories arise, You can ask gentle questions. What is being felt now? Where is this felt in the body? What does this experience need right now? These questions are not about solving the past. They are about caring for the present. Over time, the relationship to memory changes. Memories may still appear, but they no longer destabilize. They are met with calm curiosity rather than panic. This calm does not mean indifference, it means balance. You can remember without reopening the wound. Acceptance also allows forgiveness to remain unfinished. Forgiveness is often treated as a final act. Buddhism sees it as a process. Some things may never be fully forgiven. This does not mean you are failing. It means honesty is present. Honest forgiveness evolves. It deepens slowly. It does not need to be forced. Living with unresolved memories also strengthens presence. When you stop being pulled backward by the need to fix the past, attention settles more easily in the now. Life feels less divided. This presence does not erase history. It integrates it. The past becomes part of you without controlling you. As acceptance deepens, you may notice that some memories lose emotional charge on their own. Others remain tender. Both are allowed. There is no timeline. This gentleness creates trust. You trust yourself to meet what arises. You trust that unresolved does not mean unlivable. As the past is allowed to remain unresolved without being rewritten, another habit quietly becomes visible. Even when memories are met with acceptance, the mind often rushes to explain them, to decide what they meant, to turn pain into a lesson before it has finished speaking. This rush feels helpful, it feels mature, but beneath it lives a subtle kind of harm. There is a deep discomfort in not knowing why something hurt. The mind wants suffering to make sense. It wants pain to lead somewhere. It wants a reason that justifies what was endured. When meaning is not immediately available, the mind often creates one. This is where premature meaning begins. Premature meaning is not insight, it is a defense. It arises when uncertainty feels unbearable. The mind tells a story to restore order. This happened to make me stronger. This loss taught me a lesson. This pain had to happen for my growth. These statements can be true over time, but when they are applied too early, they do violence to experience. This violence is not loud or obvious. It does not look like anger or denial. It looks like wisdom. It sounds like maturity, but it bypasses something essential. It bypasses the raw reality of suffering before it has been fully felt. Buddhist teachings do not deny that suffering can lead to insight. They deny the idea that suffering must immediately mean something. They recognize that wisdom matures slowly, that forcing meaning onto pain interrupts its natural unfolding. When meaning is assigned too quickly, pain is not allowed to be pain. It is turned into a tool, a stepping stone, a justification. This can feel empowering, but it often disconnects you from what actually happened inside you. Pain has its own language, sensations, emotions, confusion, shock, sadness. When you rush to explain pain, you stop listening to that language. You move away from the body and into the mind. This creates a split between experience and interpretation. This split is exhausting. The body holds what the mind has rushed past. Unfelt pain does not disappear. It becomes tension. It becomes numbness. It becomes reactivity. The meaning may sound positive, but the nervous system knows something was skipped. Buddhism emphasizes direct experience over interpretation. It invites you to feel what is present before deciding what it means. This does not mean rejecting meaning. It means letting meaning arise organically rather than forcing it. The violence of premature meaning is especially clear in how people respond to others' suffering. When someone shares pain, there is often an impulse to explain it away, to say it happened for a reason, to point out a silver lining. While well-intentioned, these responses can invalidate the person's experience. The same thing happens internally. When you tell yourself too quickly that your suffering had a purpose, you may be trying to comfort yourself. But you may also be silencing a deeper truth that needs time to surface. Buddhist acceptance allows suffering to remain meaningless for a while. This can feel unsettling. We are conditioned to believe that pain without meaning is unbearable. But often, it is the pressure to find meaning that makes pain unbearable. When suffering is allowed to exist without explanation, it moves differently. It breathes, it shifts, it reveals layers. Some of these layers may later offer insight, others may not. Both are valid. There is also humility in not assigning meaning too quickly. It acknowledges that understanding has limits, that the mind does not immediately know why things happen. This humility protects against false conclusions. False conclusions can shape identity in harmful ways. If you decide too quickly that your pain defines who you are, you may lock yourself into a narrow story. You become the one who suffered for this reason. This story may offer coherence, but it can also restrict growth. Buddhism warns against clinging to narratives. Narratives give structure, but they also freeze experience. When suffering is turned into a fixed lesson, it stops evolving. It becomes static. Wisdom, in contrast, remains flexible. It allows meanings to change as understanding deepens. What pain means to you now may not be what it means later. Forcing meaning early prevents this evolution. Premature meaning also interferes with compassion. When you believe suffering must lead to growth, you may judge yourself or others for not improving fast enough. Pain becomes something to justify rather than something to care for. Buddhist compassion does not ask suffering to prove its worth. It meets suffering because it exists. It does not demand lessons. It offers presence. There is also a difference between meaning and meaning-making. Meaning may arise naturally over time without effort. Meaning-making is an activity of the mind trying to control discomfort. Buddhism encourages patience with this distinction. When you allow suffering to remain open, something subtle happens. The mind relaxes its grip. It stops trying to solve the experience. This relaxation allows awareness to deepen. Deep awareness is where insight matures, not in explanations, but in seeing. Seeing how pain feels, seeing how it moves, seeing how resistance intensifies it, seeing how acceptance softens it. This seeing is not dramatic. It is quiet. It does not announce itself as wisdom, but it changes how you relate to life. Premature meaning often arises from fear of chaos. The mind wants order. It wants to believe that suffering follows rules. Buddhism does not deny patterns. It denies the need to impose them prematurely. Life is complex. Causes are layered. Effects unfold over time. Reducing suffering to a single meaning oversimplifies reality. This simplification may feel comforting, but it limits understanding. Allowing meaning to remain unfinished creates space for deeper truths to emerge. These truths are often less tidy, but more accurate. They acknowledge loss without justification. They allow grief without redemption. This does not lead to despair. It leads to honesty. Honesty is grounding. It removes false hope and replaces it with presence. There is also courage in staying with suffering without explanation. It requires trust. Trust that you can be with pain without collapsing. Trust that not knowing is survivable. Buddhist practice builds this trust gradually, through mindfulness, through observation, through compassion. Each time you stay with experience without explaining it away, trust grows. This trust changes your relationship with uncertainty. You no longer need immediate answers. You become comfortable with questions that remain open. Over time, meaning may arise naturally, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet understanding. This understanding feels different. It does not erase pain, it integrates it. When meaning arises organically, it does not demand belief. It does not feel forced. It resonates because it is aligned with lived experience. The violence of premature meaning also affects how societies treat suffering. Cultures often demand that pain be productive, that it lead to growth, that it justify itself. Buddhism challenges this demand by affirming the inherent dignity of experience. Suffering does not need to earn its place. It already belongs. When you stop assigning meaning too quickly, you allow wisdom to unfold at its own pace. You stop rushing insight. You stop turning life into a lesson plan. This patience creates depth. Depth creates stability. Stability allows acceptance to deepen. As acceptance deepens, you may notice lingering emotions that do not resolve neatly, feelings that remain without clear stories. Rather than seeing them as problems, you begin to sense their role as messengers. This opens another dimension of understanding, where emotions themselves become guides rather than obstacles. As the need to explain suffering begins to soften, something else remains quietly present. Not a story, not a conclusion, just a feeling that hasn't gone anywhere. An emotion that lingers without a clear reason, without a clear ending. This is where many people grow uneasy. And this is where another misunderstanding waits to be untangled. There is a strong belief that emotions are meant to resolve, that sadness should fade, anger should cool, fear should disappear once it has been understood. When emotions linger, they are often treated as failures, signs that something is wrong, signs that healing is incomplete. But Buddhism offers a different view. Lingering emotions are not mistakes. They are messages that have not yet been fully received. Emotional loose ends are feelings that remain after the mind believes it should have moved on. They surface quietly, sometimes without a clear trigger. A heaviness in the chest, a tightness in the throat, a low-level irritation, a subtle grief. These emotions often confuse people because they do not fit into a clean narrative. They resist explanation. They do not respond to logic. Because they are uncomfortable, the instinct is to solve them, to analyze them, to label them, to get rid of them. But this instinct turns emotions into problems. Buddhism teaches that emotions are not problems to solve. They are experiences to listen to. When emotions linger, it is not because they are stubborn. It is often because they are subtle. They carry information that cannot be accessed through thinking. They speak through sensation, tone, and mood. When you try to solve them intellectually, you miss their language. Emotions refine awareness by slowing you down. They draw attention inward. They ask you to notice what is happening beneath the surface of your life. This noticing is not analysis. It is presence. Many emotional loose ends are connected to needs that were never acknowledged. Needs for safety, for recognition, for rest, for boundaries. When these needs are unmet, emotions linger as reminders. Not to punish you, but to protect you. Anger that lingers may be pointing to a boundary that was crossed. Sadness that remains may be honoring something that mattered deeply. Fear that does not fade may be signaling vulnerability that needs care. These emotions are not asking to be erased. They are asking to be understood through attention, not explanation. Buddhist practice emphasizes mindfulness of feeling. This means noticing emotions as they arise without judging them as good or bad, without trying to fix them. When you sit with an emotion and feel it directly, something shifts. The emotion is no longer isolated. It is held within awareness. Awareness does not argue with emotions. It does not rush them. It allows them to reveal their texture, their intensity, their movement. This direct contact often changes the relationship with the emotion. It may still be present, but it is no longer overwhelming. Emotional loose ends often persist because they were never fully felt. Many people move away from emotions as soon as they appear. They distract themselves, they rationalize, they numb. This interruption prevents emotions from completing their natural cycle. Completion does not mean disappearance. It means integration. An integrated emotion does not dominate attention. It becomes part of the background of experience. It informs behavior without controlling it. Buddhism teaches that emotions arise due to conditions. They are not random. They are responses to internal and external factors. When conditions change, emotions change. When conditions are ignored, emotions persist. Lingering emotions often indicate that some condition is still present. A pattern, a belief, a situation. Trying to eliminate the emotion without addressing the condition is ineffective. Listening to the emotion helps reveal what needs attention. This listening requires patience. Emotional messages are rarely clear at first. They unfold gradually. They may contradict each other. They may feel confusing. This confusion is not a problem. It is part of the process. One of the most common mistakes is trying to feel the right emotion. People judge themselves for feeling sad when they think they should be grateful, or angry when they think they should be calm. This judgment creates inner conflict. Buddhist acceptance allows emotions to exist without comparison. You do not need to feel differently to be okay. You do not need to justify what you feel. This acceptance creates safety. Safety allows emotions to relax. When emotions feel safe, they soften. Not because they are forced to, but because they no longer need to shout. Many lingering emotions persist because they were ignored. When they are finally acknowledged, they begin to change. Emotional loose ends also refine awareness by revealing patterns. You may notice that certain emotions appear in similar situations, similar relationships, similar thoughts. These patterns are not flaws, they are information. By observing patterns without judgment, you learn about yourself. You learn what affects you, what matters to you, what challenges you. This learning is not theoretical, it is lived. Buddhism emphasizes non-identification with emotions. You experience emotions, but you are not them. This distinction is crucial. When you identify with an emotion, it becomes your identity. When you observe it, it becomes a teacher. Observing does not mean distancing, it means staying present without merging. You feel the emotion fully, but you do not let it define who you are. Lingering emotions often carry wisdom about limits. They show where you may be overextending, where you may be ignoring your own needs, where you may be tolerating what does not align with you. Listening to these messages can lead to changes in behavior, in boundaries, in priorities. These changes are not reactions, they are responses informed by awareness. Emotional loose ends also deepen compassion. When you accept your own lingering emotions, you become more patient with others. You recognize that not everyone resolves feelings quickly. You stop expecting emotional neatness. This patience improves relationships. You listen more. You judge less. You allow complexity. This creates trust. Buddhism teaches that emotions are impermanent, but impermanence does not mean speed. Some emotions move slowly. They unfold over long periods. Respecting their pace prevents unnecessary struggle. Trying to rush emotions often backfires. Suppressed emotions return stronger. Ignored emotions find other outlets. Acceptance allows emotions to move naturally. Emotional awareness also strengthens resilience. When you trust that you can feel emotions without being overwhelmed, fear decreases. You no longer need to avoid discomfort. This confidence allows you to meet life more fully. Lingering emotions are not signs of weakness, they are signs of sensitivity. Sensitivity is not fragility. It is responsiveness. It allows you to detect subtle changes in your inner and outer world. Buddhism values this sensitivity. It sees it as a foundation for wisdom. A sensitive mind notices more, it understands more, it responds more skillfully. As awareness refines, emotions become less dramatic. They still arise, but they do not hijack attention. You notice them, learn from them, and let them pass when they are ready. This does not mean emotional life becomes flat. It becomes balanced. Joy is deeper. Sadness is gentler. Anger is clearer. Fear is informative. Emotional loose ends also teach humility. They remind you that not everything can be controlled, that inner life has its own timing. This humility reduces self-judgment. When you stop seeing emotions as problems, you stop fighting yourself. Inner conflict decreases. Peace becomes more accessible. This peace does not come from emotional resolution. It comes from emotional inclusion. Nothing is excluded from awareness. Everything belongs. As emotional awareness deepens and feelings are allowed to linger without being fixed, another quiet tension often rises to the surface. It is not about pain anymore. It is about being seen, or more precisely, about not being seen. Even when you accept your emotions, even when you listen to them without judgment, there can still be a strong urge to explain yourself to others, to clarify, to justify, to make sure you are understood. This urge feels natural. Humans are relational beings. Being misunderstood can feel threatening. It can feel like erasure, rejection, or injustice. The body tightens when words are misheard. The mind rushes to correct the story. DFO rises almost instantly. But Buddhism invites a radical shift here. It suggests that peace does not require being understood. In fact, clinging to the need to be understood often becomes a hidden source of suffering. The need to be understood is deeply tied to identity. When someone misunderstands you, it can feel as if they are misunderstanding who you are. The ego reacts quickly because it believes its survival depends on clarity and recognition. This reaction is subtle. It may appear as explaining yourself again, or arguing, or replaying conversations in your head, trying to say it better next time. But each attempt to secure understanding often reinforces the very tension you are trying to release. You become invested in controlling how others see you. You begin to measure peace by external agreement. When agreement does not come, frustration grows. Buddhist acceptance asks a difficult question. What if misunderstanding is allowed to exist? What if you do not correct it? What if you let people hold incomplete or inaccurate views of you without defending yourself? This question is uncomfortable because it touches vulnerability. Being misunderstood can feel unsafe. The mind fears that silence will be taken as guilt or weakness. But silence can also be strength. Not the strength of dominance, but the strength of non-attachment. Renouncing the need to be understood does not mean you stop communicating. It means you stop depending on communication to secure your inner stability. You speak when it is appropriate, but you no longer feel compelled to convince. You no longer chase agreement as proof of your worth. This shift changes how conversations feel. You listen more, you explain less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you are no longer trying to manage perception. When you speak, it comes from clarity rather than defense. Buddhism teaches that clinging creates suffering. Clinging to being understood is a refined form of attachment. It ties your peace to other people's interpretations. But interpretations are unstable. They change based on mood, history, and bias. Building peace on them is fragile. When you allow misunderstanding to exist, something unexpected happens. The nervous system relaxes. The constant scanning for validation slows. You are no longer living inside other people's minds. You return to your own experience. This does not mean you become indifferent. You still care, but you care without grasping. You accept that others see through their own lenses. You stop fighting that reality. There is also humility in this acceptance. You recognize that no one is fully understood, including yourself. Your own understanding of who you are changes over time. Expecting others to hold a clear, stable image of you is unrealistic. Renouncing the need to be understood also reduces conflict. Many arguments are not about facts, but about being seen. When this need softens, arguments lose energy. You no longer feel the need to win. You become less reactive. This does not mean you tolerate harm or injustice. Boundaries still matter. Speaking up still matters. The difference is motivation. You speak to express truth, not to control perception. Buddhist practice supports this through non-attachment to views. Views are understood as provisional. They are useful but not ultimate. When someone misunderstands you, they are holding a view. That view does not define you. Seeing this clearly creates space. You do not collapse into others' opinions. You do not need to correct every misconception. You choose when to engage. There is also freedom in allowing yourself to be unknown. Much of the pressure to perform comes from the desire to be seen accurately. When that pressure lifts, authenticity becomes easier. You are less concerned with how you appear. You are more concerned with how you live. Renouncing the need to be understood also deepens compassion. When you see how strongly you want to be understood, you recognize the same desire in others. This recognition softens judgment. You become more patient with people who over-explain or defend themselves. This patience improves relationships. You give others space to be imperfect in their understanding. You stop demanding emotional precision. Connection becomes less rigid. There is also a deep peace in realizing that misunderstanding does not harm awareness. Awareness remains intact regardless of how you are perceived. This realization shifts your center of gravity inward. Buddhism emphasizes that the self is not fixed. If the self is fluid, then any attempt to define it fully is incomplete. Being misunderstood is inevitable. Accepting this inevitability reduces resistance. The need to be understood often intensifies during emotional moments. When you are hurt, you want others to know why. When you change, you want others to see the growth. When you struggle, you want empathy. These desires are human. Buddhism does not shame them. It invites you to notice when they turn into demands. Demands create tension, requests create openness. When you renounce the demand to be understood, you can still ask to be heard, but you are no longer devastated if it does not happen. This distinction is subtle but powerful. It allows you to remain open without becoming dependent. Renouncing the need to be understood also frees creativity. Artists, thinkers, and innovators often face misunderstanding. When they are not attached to immediate recognition, they can continue exploring. When they need validation, creativity tightens. This applies to everyday life as well. When you stop needing approval for your inner experience, you explore it more honestly. You become curious rather than defensive. Buddhism teaches equanimity. Equanimity is the ability to remain balanced amid praise and blame. Renouncing the need to be understood is a direct practice of equanimity. You allow others' views to rise and fall without being pulled by them. This does not make you cold. It makes you stable. There is also courage in allowing misunderstanding. It takes courage to stand without explanation. To trust that your experience does not need constant translation. This courage grows with practice. Over time, you may notice that when you stop trying to be understood, understanding sometimes arises naturally. People sense authenticity when it is not forced, but this is no longer the goal. It is a byproduct. Peace deepens when it is no longer negotiated through others' minds. You stop rehearsing conversations. You stop defending yourself internally. Mental space opens. This space is not empty. It is spacious. It allows you to respond thoughtfully rather than reflexively. As the need to be understood loosens, another fear often takes its place. A quieter one, a heavier one. The fear that acceptance itself means you have failed, that by no longer resisting, explaining, or correcting, you have somehow given up. This fear is powerful because it sounds responsible, it sounds strong, but it is also deeply mistaken. There is a moment when acceptance begins to work, and instead of relief, doubt appears. You may wonder if you are settling, if you are avoiding effort, if you are betraying your potential. This is where acceptance is most often misunderstood. It is mistaken for collapse rather than courage. Many people are taught that strength means pushing forward, fixing problems, overcoming obstacles, improving constantly. Within this mindset, surrender looks like weakness, letting go looks like defeat, acceptance looks like failure. But Buddhism offers a radically different understanding of strength. Acceptance is not the absence of effort, it is the absence of inner violence. Inner violence is the constant pressure to be different from what you are, to feel something else, to arrive somewhere else, to correct yourself before you are allowed to rest. Acceptance ends this violence. And because this violence has often been mistaken for motivation, its absence can feel like emptiness or loss. This is why acceptance can feel like failure at first. The familiar tension is gone, the inner struggle quiets. Without struggle, the ego feels disoriented. It asks, if I am not fighting, am I doing enough? This question reveals how deeply identity has been tied to resistance. Buddhist teachings emphasize that suffering is not created by pain alone, but by resistance to pain. When resistance ends, suffering decreases. But the ego often interprets this decrease as passivity. It confuses peace with stagnation. In reality, acceptance creates clarity. When you stop fighting what is, you see more clearly what can be done. Action that arises from acceptance is not driven by fear or shame. It is driven by understanding. This distinction is subtle but important. Effort driven by fear is tense. Effort driven by understanding is steady. Acceptance removes panic from effort. It does not remove effort itself. When acceptance feels like failure, it is often because expectations were attached to struggle. You may have believed that suffering proved commitment, that exhaustion proved care, that constant effort proved worth. When acceptance enters, these proofs disappear. This can trigger guilt. You may feel undeserving of ease. You may feel lazy. You may feel as if you are cheating. Buddhism recognizes this guilt as another conditioned response, not as truth. True surrender is not collapse. Collapse happens when you give up because you feel powerless. Acceptance happens when you stop fighting because you see clearly. One is resignation, the other is wisdom. Wisdom knows when effort helps and when it harms. Wisdom recognizes that some battles drain more than they give. Letting go of those battles is not weakness. It is discernment. Buddhist acceptance also requires courage because it asks you to feel things fully. Resistance numbs pain. Acceptance exposes it. This exposure takes bravery. It is easier to stay busy, angry, or distracted than to sit with vulnerability. When you accept, you remove armor. This can feel risky, but armor also restricts movement. Without it, you are more flexible, more responsive, more alive. Acceptance also challenges the idea that you must always be improving. Improvement culture teaches that there is always something wrong with you. Acceptance questions this assumption. It asks whether constant self-correction is actually healthy. This does not mean denying harmful patterns. It means addressing them without hatred. Change that comes from self-rejection is unstable. Change that comes from self-understanding lasts. When acceptance feels like failure, it is often because the mind is comparing the present to an imagined ideal. Acceptance refuses this comparison. It says, this is what is here now. That honesty can feel disappointing if you expected more, but disappointment is not proof of failure. It is proof that expectations were present. Buddhism teaches that expectations are often the source of suffering. Releasing them brings relief, not defeat. Acceptance also disrupts the narrative of heroism. Many people are attached to the idea of overcoming, of conquering inner struggles, of winning against pain. Acceptance offers a quieter story, one of coexistence rather than conquest. This quieter story does not feel as dramatic. There is no victory moment, no clear ending. This can feel unsatisfying to a mind trained on resolution. But life itself is not a dramatic arc. It is a continuous unfolding. Courage in Buddhism is not loud. It is steady. It is the courage to stay present, to not turn away, to not attack yourself, to remain open even when answers are unclear. When acceptance is practiced consistently, you may notice that problems still exist, pain still arises, uncertainty remains. But your relationship to them changes. They no longer define your worth. They no longer dominate your identity. This change can feel like loss because struggle was familiar, but it is actually a gain. You gain space, you gain perspective, you gain energy. Acceptance also changes how you relate to others. You stop trying to fix them. You stop needing to prove yourself. You stop measuring interactions as wins or losses. This creates calmer relationships. When acceptance feels like failure, it is often because productivity has been mistaken for value. Buddhism separates being from doing. Your worth is not measured by output or progress. Awareness has intrinsic value. This recognition is deeply freeing. It allows rest without guilt. It allows pauses without anxiety. It allows mistakes without collapse. Surrender in Buddhism is not about giving up responsibility. It is about giving up illusion. The illusion that you can control everything. The illusion that resistance guarantees safety. The illusion that struggle is always noble. Letting go of these illusions takes courage because they have shaped identity. You may not know who you are without them. Acceptance invites you to find out. This discovery is not instant. It unfolds gradually. As acceptance becomes familiar, confidence grows. Not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of trust. Trust in your capacity to meet life. This trust is quieter than ambition, but it is more reliable. It does not depend on success. It does not collapse with failure. When acceptance no longer feels like failure, you realize something important. You were never failing by feeling what you felt. You were only fighting it. As acceptance no longer feels like defeat, something else begins to loosen quietly in the background. The need to explain your life, the need to make it sound sensible, the need to shape everything you have lived into a clean story with a beginning, a lesson, and a conclusion. When this need relaxes, the mind exhales in a way it did not know was possible. There is a deep habit of turning life into a narrative. You tell yourself who you are based on what happened. You connect events into meaning. You search for arcs, themes, turning points. This habit is not wrong. Stories help us communicate and remember. But when identity becomes dependent on having a coherent story, suffering quietly grows. Many people feel uneasy when their life story feels fragmented, when events do not line up, when choices contradict each other, when growth does not follow a clear direction. This unease often leads to constant self-editing. You revise the past mentally, you justify decisions, you smooth over inconsistencies, you try to make yourself make sense. This self-editing is exhausting. It requires constant monitoring. Every new experience must be fit into the existing story or explained away. When something does not fit, tension arises. You may feel confused about who you are or ashamed of contradictions. Buddhism sees this tension as unnecessary. Buddhist teachings do not deny narrative, they deny its authority. They point out that the self is not a story. It is a process. Stories are snapshots taken from movement. Treating them as final creates rigidity. Living without narrative closure means allowing your life to remain unfinished, unthemed, and sometimes contradictory. It means not forcing events to justify each other. It means letting experiences stand on their own without being woven into a single explanation. This can feel disorienting at first. The mind likes continuity. It likes to know who it is. Dropping narrative closure can feel like losing identity. But what is actually lost is a burden. The burden of coherence is heavy. It requires you to always know what your life means. It requires you to defend that meaning when it is questioned. It requires you to edit yourself constantly to stay consistent. Buddhism invites you to set this burden down. Without narrative closure, life becomes more spacious. You no longer need to explain yourself internally. You no longer need to justify changes. You are allowed to grow in ways that do not match your past. This freedom is especially important for healing. When you demand a coherent story, you may rush to assign meaning or lessons prematurely. You may feel pressure to turn pain into wisdom quickly. Letting go of narrative closure allows experiences to remain raw until they naturally integrate. Buddhism emphasizes impermanence not just of events, but of interpretations. What something means today may change tomorrow. Locking meaning into a fixed story prevents this natural evolution. Living without narrative closure also reduces regret. Regret often comes from comparing your life story to an imagined better one. When you stop telling your life as a story with a correct plot, comparison loses its grip. You stop judging chapters as mistakes. This does not erase responsibility. It removes unnecessary self-punishment. You can acknowledge harm without turning it into a defining identity. Narrative closure also affects how people relate to success. Success is often used to justify the story. When success fades or changes, identity shakes. Without narrative closure, success is experienced without clinging. It is appreciated without being used as proof of worth. Buddhist practice encourages moment-to-moment awareness. Awareness does not tell stories. It notices sensations, thoughts, and feelings as they arise. When you rest in awareness, the need to narrate decreases. This does not mean you stop thinking. It means thinking is no longer the center of experience. Life is lived directly rather than interpreted constantly. Constant self-editing creates anxiety. You worry about how actions will look later. You worry about consistency. You worry about explaining yourself. When narrative closure is dropped, this anxiety softens. You act more naturally. This naturalness does not mean impulsivity. It means responsiveness. You respond to what is present rather than to an internal script. Living without narrative closure also improves relationships. You stop defining people by past interactions. You allow them to change without forcing explanations. You stop holding them to old versions of themselves. This openness creates room for genuine connection. You meet people as they are now, not as characters in a shared story. Buddhism teaches non-self. This does not mean you do not exist. It means the self is not fixed. When you see this clearly, narrative closure becomes unnecessary. There is no final version of you to explain. This insight brings relief. You stop trying to arrive at a definitive identity. You stop worrying about how your life will be summarized. You focus on living rather than documenting. Many people fear that without a story, life will feel meaningless. Buddhism offers a different understanding of meaning. Meaning is not something you impose after the fact. It arises from presence, from care, from attention. When you are present, life feels meaningful without explanation. You do not need to know what it means to feel that it matters. Narrative closure often arises from fear of chaos. The mind wants order. Buddhism does not deny order. It denies the need to force it prematurely. Life has its own intelligence. It does not require constant narration. Dropping narrative closure also allows silence. Silence between events, silence between thoughts, silence that is not empty but full. This silence is where peace deepens. Not because things make sense, but because they do not need to. Without narrative closure, you are free to contradict yourself, to change direction, to outgrow beliefs, to revisit old feelings. None of this needs to be explained away. It is simply movement. This movement feels alive. Stories often freeze life. Letting them loosen brings fluidity. There is also humility in this approach. You admit that you do not fully understand your life. that you may never fully understand it. This humility is not defeat, it is realism. Buddhism values this realism. It sees wisdom as the ability to live without certainty, not the ability to construct perfect explanations. When narrative closure is no longer required, the mind rests. It stops rehearsing, it stops rewriting, it stops anticipating judgment. This rest does not end curiosity, it refines it. You become curious about experience itself, not about what it says about you. Living without narrative closure also prepares you for loss. Loss often shatters stories. When you are not attached to a single narrative, loss is still painful, but it does not destroy identity. You grieve, but you do not collapse into confusion about who you are. You remain open. As the need to hold life together as a clean story begins to loosen, another habit quietly steps forward. Even when you stop narrating who you are, there can still be a subtle urge to keep score, to watch how things turn out, to measure whether your actions worked, to track outcomes as proof that you acted correctly. This is where another layer of attachment hides, not in identity, but in results. There is a deep comfort in knowing how things will end. When you act, you want reassurance that it mattered, that it produced the right effect, that it will come back to you in a fair way. This desire feels responsible, even moral. But Buddhism invites a much gentler and more demanding discipline, acting without knowing what will follow. Karma is often misunderstood as a system of rewards and punishments. Do good and good will return. Do harm and harm will follow. While this simplified view is popular, Buddhist teaching goes deeper. Karma is not a scoreboard. It is a web of causes and conditions so complex that no single mind can trace it fully. To believe you can track outcomes accurately is already a misunderstanding. Unfinished karma means recognizing that actions do not belong to you once they are done. The moment an action leaves you, it enters a field of conditions beyond control. Other people's choices, timing, context, and chance all interact with it. Expecting a clear result is unrealistic. Clinging to outcomes creates tension. When you track results, intention becomes contaminated. You may not notice it at first, but subtle expectations creep in. You act kindly, but wait to be appreciated. You speak honestly, but hope it changes someone. You help, but look for confirmation that it mattered. These expectations are not wrong, but they bind your peace to what happens next. Buddhism teaches that the purity of an action lies in its intention, not in its outcome. Intention is the one part you can truly touch. Outcome belongs to the world. When intention is clean, action is free. When intention is tied to results, action becomes anxious. Letting go of outcomes does not mean acting carelessly. It means acting fully, then releasing the action. You do what is appropriate, ethical, and sincere, and then you let it go. This release is not indifference. It is trust in the complexity of life. The urge to know outcomes often comes from fear. Fear that effort will be wasted. Fear that goodness will go unnoticed. Fear that mistakes will define you. Tracking results feels like protection, but it actually creates restlessness. You replay actions mentally. You wonder if you said the right thing. You check for signs of impact. This mental checking keeps you tied to the past. The action is over, but you are still living inside it. Buddhism sees this as unnecessary suffering. Once an action is done, the only thing left is memory. Reliving it does not change its effect. Unfinished karma asks you to tolerate not knowing if your kindness helped, not knowing if your honesty mattered, not knowing if your effort will bear fruit. This tolerance builds inner strength. When you stop tracking outcomes, intention becomes simpler. You act because it is right, not because it will pay off. This simplicity is deeply freeing. It removes calculation from ethics. You are no longer negotiating with life. This shift also changes how failure is experienced. When results are not as hoped, You do not collapse into self-blame. You review intention instead of outcome. Was the action sincere? Was it aligned with care and clarity? If yes, you rest. If not, you learn. Either way, you move forward. Buddhist practice emphasizes non-attachment to fruits of action. This does not mean detachment from responsibility. It means releasing ownership of results. You remain responsible for what you do, not for how the universe responds. This teaching is especially important in relationships. When you act with expectation, relationships become transactional. You give in order to receive. You listen in order to be understood. You apologize in order to be forgiven. When outcomes do not follow, resentment appears. Unfinished karma allows relationships to breathe. You show up sincerely, then allow others to respond as they will. This reduces manipulation and pressure. It increases authenticity. Letting go of outcomes also protects compassion. When compassion is tied to results, burnout follows. You become discouraged when people do not change. You feel ineffective. Buddhism teaches compassion without attachment. You care because care matters, not because it guarantees success. This kind of compassion is sustainable. It does not require proof. It does not depend on visible impact. It flows naturally. Unfinished karma also reshapes how you view mistakes. When outcomes are unpredictable, mistakes are inevitable. Releasing outcome attachment allows you to make mistakes without collapsing. You adjust intention rather than condemning yourself. There is also humility in this practice. You accept that you cannot see the full chain of cause and effect. What looks like failure now may be beneficial later. What looks like success may create problems. Not knowing keeps you open. This openness reduces arrogance. You stop assuming you know what is best for others. You act with care, then step back. This respects the autonomy of life. Buddhist teachings emphasize right action, right speech, and right livelihood. These are not outcome guarantees. They are orientation tools. They guide how you act, not what you get. When intention is purified by letting go of results, actions feel lighter. You are less burdened by expectation. You act more freely. Joy returns to effort. Tracking outcomes also creates anxiety about the future. You worry about consequences. You imagine scenarios. You rehearse regrets. Releasing outcomes calms this anxiety. You deal with what is present rather than what might happen. This does not mean ignoring consequences. It means responding when consequences arise, not obsessing before they do. Unfinished karma also allows gratitude. When good outcomes occur, you appreciate them without claiming ownership. You recognize that many conditions contributed. This gratitude is less possessive. When outcomes are unpleasant, you meet them with curiosity rather than shock. You ask what can be learned, not who to blame. There is also peace in knowing that not everything you do will make sense immediately. Some actions ripen slowly, some never show visible results. This does not diminish their value. Buddhism teaches that intention shapes the mind. Even if outcomes are unseen, acting with integrity refines awareness. This refinement is its own fruit. Letting go of outcomes also deepens presence. You stop living mentally ahead of yourself. You return to the current moment. Action becomes an expression of now, not a strategy for later. This presence reduces regret. When you act fully, there is less second-guessing. You trust that you did what you could with what you knew. Unfinished karma also dissolves superstition. You stop trying to read signs. You stop interpreting events as rewards or punishments. Life becomes less personal in its movements. This reduces fear. Acceptance of not knowing outcomes builds resilience. You learn to adapt rather than predict. You respond rather than control. As this acceptance settles, intention becomes clearer. You notice why you act. You notice when fear enters. You adjust gently. This self-awareness is transformative. Acting without tracking results also aligns with unfinishedness. Just as life does not require narrative closure, action does not require outcome closure. Both are allowed to remain open. This openness is grace. Grace is not something given, it is something allowed by not grasping, allowed by trusting process over control. As the grip on outcomes loosens and actions are released without waiting for results, attention naturally turns inward again. Not toward effort, not toward intention, but toward feeling. Even when you no longer track what actions produce, there can still be a quiet expectation that emotions should eventually be finished. That sadness should end, that fear should disappear, that anger should resolve completely. This expectation feels reasonable. It is also one of the most persistent illusions of the inner life. There is a common belief that emotional health means emotional resolution, that healing is complete when certain feelings are no longer present, that peace is proven by the absence of pain. This belief shapes how people judge themselves. If grief returns, something must be wrong. If anxiety resurfaces, progress must have been lost. If sadness lingers, healing must be incomplete. Buddhist acceptance gently challenges this entire framework. It does not define peace as emotional emptiness. It defines peace as a wise relationship to experience. Some feelings are not meant to disappear. They are meant to change their role. Emotional resolution sounds comforting because it promises finality. It suggests that one day you will feel clean inside, clear, untouched by old wounds. But life does not work this way. Human experience leaves traces. Love leaves tenderness. Loss leaves memory. Care leaves vulnerability. Expecting emotions to vanish entirely is not realistic. It is a misunderstanding of how the heart works. The illusion of emotional resolution often comes from treating emotions like problems to be solved. When a problem is solved, it goes away. But emotions are not problems. They are responses. They arise from connection, from meaning, from sensitivity. Trying to eliminate them misunderstands their purpose. Some emotions soften instead of ending. They become quieter, less reactive, less central. They move from the foreground of awareness to the background. They no longer demand attention, but they still exist. This softening is not failure, it is maturity. Buddhist teachings emphasize impermanence, but impermanence does not mean erasure. It means change. Emotions change in intensity, frequency, and impact. Expecting them to disappear completely creates unnecessary struggle. Grief is a clear example. Grief may soften over time, but it often never fully leaves. A song, a smell, a memory can bring it back. This does not mean grief is unresolved. It means love was real. Grief becomes a quiet companion rather than an overwhelming force. When people expect grief to end, they may judge themselves harshly when it returns. This judgment creates secondary suffering. The original grief is painful enough. Adding self-criticism makes it heavier. Buddhism teaches compassion toward ongoing feeling. It allows grief to exist without labeling it as a problem. This compassion reduces suffering more effectively than forcing closure. The same is true for fear. Fear does not disappear entirely because it serves a function. It alerts, it protects. Over time, fear may become less intense, less frequent, less controlling. But expecting fear to vanish sets an unrealistic standard. When fear arises and is judged as regression, anxiety increases. When fear is accepted as part of sensitivity, it passes more easily. The illusion of emotional resolution also affects joy. People may believe they should always feel happy once healed. When happiness fluctuates, disappointment arises. Buddhism does not promise permanent happiness. It promises freedom from clinging to happiness. Clinging to emotional states, even pleasant ones, creates suffering. Wanting sadness to disappear and happiness to stay are two sides of the same attachment. Both resist impermanence. Acceptance allows emotions to move naturally. They arise, peak, soften, and fade according to conditions. This movement cannot be forced, it must be allowed. Some emotions linger because they are still relevant. They may signal values, boundaries, or care. Trying to eliminate them removes useful information. For example, a quiet sadness may indicate a need for rest. A low-level irritation may point to an unmet boundary. A subtle anxiety may signal uncertainty that needs attention. These emotions are not asking to be erased. They are asking to be heard. Buddhist mindfulness practices encourage feeling emotions directly, not analyzing them, not suppressing them. Feeling allows emotions to complete their natural cycle. Suppression interrupts this cycle. Overanalysis traps it. When you feel an emotion fully, without resisting or feeding it, it often changes on its own. This change is organic. It cannot be scheduled. The illusion of resolution often leads to emotional control strategies. People try to manage emotions through distraction, positive thinking, or constant self-regulation. While these strategies may reduce discomfort temporarily, they often prevent deeper integration. Integration means emotions are included in awareness without dominating it. You can feel sadness and still function. You can feel fear and still act. You can feel anger and still choose wisely. This ability does not require emotions to disappear. It requires relationship to change. Buddhist acceptance trains this relationship. It teaches that awareness is larger than any emotion. Emotions arise within awareness, not as awareness. This perspective creates space. In this space, emotions soften naturally, not because they are forced out, but because they are no longer resisted. The illusion of emotional resolution also creates pressure to perform healing. People feel they must appear emotionally stable. They hide lingering feelings to meet expectations. This hiding creates isolation. Acceptance allows honesty. You can acknowledge that some feelings remain without shame. This honesty reduces inner conflict. There is also a cultural pressure to move on quickly. Productivity culture values efficiency, even in emotions. Buddhism resists this. It respects emotional timing. It recognizes that inner life unfolds at its own pace. Expecting emotional resolution often comes from fear of vulnerability. Lingering emotions remind us of openness, of connection, of risk. Trying to eliminate them is an attempt to protect ourselves. But protection through numbness comes at a cost. It dulls joy as well as pain. Acceptance allows sensitivity without overwhelm. Emotions that soften over time become wisdom. They inform choices. They deepen empathy. They refine awareness. They no longer dominate behavior, but they enrich understanding. For example, lingering sadness may deepen compassion for others who suffer. Lingering fear may increase caution and care. Lingering tenderness may strengthen connection. These are not failures of healing, they are outcomes of integration. The illusion of emotional resolution also affects self-identity. People define themselves by emotional states. I should not feel this anymore. When feelings persist, identity feels threatened. Buddhism teaches non-identification. You are not your emotions. You experience them. This distinction allows emotions to exist without defining who you are. When identity loosens, emotions lose urgency. They are allowed to be what they are without demanding resolution. Acceptance also changes how you respond when emotions resurface. Instead of panic, there is recognition. This is here again. This recognition is calm. It does not escalate. This calm response reduces emotional intensity. Emotions often feed on resistance. When resistance is absent, they pass more easily. Some emotions return periodically, not because they are unresolved, but because life revisits similar themes. Change does not erase memory. It transforms relationship. Expecting emotional resolution ignores the cyclical nature of life. Experiences repeat in different forms. Emotions respond accordingly. Buddhism sees this repetition not as failure, but as deepening. Each time an emotion arises, it is met with more awareness. Over time, this awareness accumulates. This accumulation is wisdom. Wisdom is not the absence of feeling, it is skillful feeling. When you stop expecting emotions to disappear, you stop fighting yourself. You stop monitoring progress obsessively. You stop turning inner life into a performance. Peace becomes quieter, but more stable. It does not depend on emotional purity. It depends on acceptance. This acceptance does not make you passive, it makes you responsive. You respond to emotions without being ruled by them. As this understanding settles, emotional life feels less threatening. Feelings come and go, some stay longer, none require panic. As emotions are no longer forced to disappear, another tension quietly loosens beneath the surface. If feelings do not need final resolution, then something even deeper begins to soften. The need to decide who you are, the need to settle it, the need to finally arrive at a clear definition of yourself that will not change again. There is a deep discomfort in not knowing who you are. Identity feels like ground. It feels like safety. When identity is unclear, the mind searches for labels, roles, and stories to stabilize itself. You may define yourself by your past, your wounds, your strengths, your beliefs, or your goals. These definitions feel reassuring, but they come with a cost. They freeze something that is meant to move. Buddhist acceptance offers a radical freedom here. It allows identity to remain unsettled, not as confusion, but as openness, not as lack, but as space. Most suffering around identity comes from treating it as something that must be finalized. People feel pressure to know who they are, what they stand for, what they want, and where they are going. When answers shift, anxiety appears. When definitions no longer fit, fear arises. The mind asks, if I am not this, then what am I? Buddhism gently dissolves this question by pointing out that identity is not a fixed object. It is a process. Thoughts change, values evolve, desires transform, roles come and go. Trying to define yourself once and for all is like trying to capture a river in a photograph and calling it complete. Allowing identity to remain unsettled does not mean you have no personality, no values, or no direction. It means you do not cling to them as permanent. You use them without becoming trapped by them. This is deeply freeing. When identity is flexible, change is no longer a threat. Growth does not feel like betrayal of who you were. You are allowed to outgrow old versions of yourself without apology. Much inner conflict comes from defending an outdated identity. You may continue behaviors, beliefs, or roles that no longer feel true because letting go feels like losing yourself. Acceptance allows you to see that letting go is not loss, it is movement. Buddhist teachings on non-self are often misunderstood as denial of individuality. In reality, they point to freedom from fixation. You still experience preferences, traits, and tendencies, but you no longer mistake them for something permanent. When identity loosens, self-judgment softens. You stop asking whether you are being consistent with who you think you should be. You become more responsive to the present moment rather than loyal to a past definition. This responsiveness creates authenticity. Instead of acting from an image, you act from awareness. Actions feel more aligned because they are not filtered through a rigid self-concept. Allowing identity to remain unsettled also reduces fear of contradiction. You are allowed to feel strong and vulnerable, certain and unsure, independent and connected. These states no longer cancel each other out, they coexist. Many people suffer because they believe they must choose one identity and reject others. Buddhism allows multiplicity. You are not one thing. You are many expressions arising under different conditions. This understanding reduces inner tension. You stop forcing coherence where none is required. You stop editing yourself to appear consistent. Life becomes lighter. Unsettled identity also changes how you relate to the past. Past versions of yourself are no longer embarrassing or threatening. They are simply stages. You do not need to defend or reject them. You acknowledge them and move on. This creates self-compassion. You forgive yourself more easily. You understand that who you were made sense given what you knew then. Allowing identity to remain open also transforms how you approach the future. You stop chasing a fixed version of who you should become. You remain curious instead of anxious. The future becomes an exploration rather than a destination. This curiosity is alive. It keeps you engaged with learning. When identity is fixed, learning feels risky because it threatens the self-image. When identity is open, learning feels natural. Buddhist practice encourages this openness through mindfulness. When you observe thoughts and emotions, you see that none of them stay. Identity reveals itself as a collection of passing experiences rather than a solid core. This realization does not make you disappear. It makes you flexible. You are no longer trapped inside your own story. Unsettled identity also reduces comparison. When you do not need to be a certain kind of person, others stop feeling like benchmarks. You stop measuring yourself against external standards. You walk your own path. This reduces envy and superiority. You recognize that everyone is evolving differently. There is no final template. Acceptance of unsettled identity also deepens relationships. You allow others to change without feeling threatened. You stop holding them to old versions of themselves. This creates space for growth. In conflict, unsettled identity helps you listen. You are not defending a self-image. You are open to being wrong. This openness resolves tension more effectively than argument. There is also courage in not defining yourself. Society often demands labels, roles, certainty. Saying, "I don't know yet," can feel risky. But Buddhism values this honesty. It sees it as wisdom rather than weakness. This honesty removes pressure. You stop pretending. You stop performing. You become more real. Allowing identity to remain unsettled also frees creativity. Creativity thrives in openness. When you are not committed to being a certain type of person, you explore freely. You experiment. You take risks. This does not mean instability. It means adaptability. You adjust to life rather than forcing life to adjust to you. Unsettled identity also softens fear of failure. Failure only threatens fixed identities. When identity is fluid, failure is feedback, not a verdict. This perspective builds resilience. You recover faster, you learn more deeply, you move forward without shame. Buddhist acceptance does not erase responsibility. You are still accountable for actions, but accountability is not tied to identity. You correct behavior without condemning the self. This separation is powerful. It allows growth without self-hatred. When identity is allowed to remain open, peace deepens. You stop asking life to confirm who you are. You live more directly. This peace is quiet. It does not announce itself. It feels like relief from a long effort you did not realize you were making. There is also joy in this openness. Joy of discovery, joy of becoming. Joy of not knowing exactly who you will be next. This joy is not dependent on certainty. It is born from trust in change. Buddhism teaches that clinging to self creates suffering. Letting self remain unsettled dissolves that clinging gently. You do not destroy identity, you loosen it. This loosening allows awareness to shine through. Awareness is not defined, it is simply present. When you rest here, identity becomes secondary. Life feels less heavy, less serious, more playful. As identity is allowed to stay open and unfinished, another quiet assumption begins to dissolve. The belief that peace means arrival, that stillness means nothing is moving anymore, that calm only exists when conflict has ended. This belief is subtle, but it shapes how many people search for relief, and it quietly keeps peace out of reach. There is a widespread idea that stillness is the absence of movement. That peace is a final state where thoughts stop, emotions settle permanently, and life no longer challenges you. This image is comforting, but it is not realistic. It turns peace into a destination rather than a way of being. Buddhism offers a different understanding. Stillness does not mean completion. It means presence with what is moving. Many people become discouraged in practice because movement continues. Thoughts arise, emotions fluctuate, conflicts appear. They assume something is wrong. They believe they have not gone deep enough. But Buddhism teaches that movement is not the opposite of peace. Resistance is. Stillness is not a frozen moment. It is a quality of awareness that remains steady even as experiences change. It is the calm center of a turning wheel, not the absence of motion altogether. When stillness is misunderstood as completion, people wait for life to quiet down before they allow themselves to rest. They postpone peace until problems are solved, until emotions stabilize, until uncertainty disappears. This waiting creates constant dissatisfaction. Buddhist acceptance removes this waiting. It teaches that peace is available now, even while things are unresolved. Not because problems vanish, but because awareness stops fighting their presence. Flux is the natural state of life. Bodies change, relationships evolve, emotions shift. Thoughts come and go. Expecting stillness to mean the end of flux is expecting life to stop being life. Peace in Buddhism is the ability to remain present within flux without being pulled apart by it. This is a different skill than control. It is closer to balance. Balance does not require stillness in the sense of immobility. It requires responsiveness. A balanced body moves. A balanced mind adapts. Stillness here means non-reactivity, not inactivity. This distinction is important because many people try to suppress movement to feel calm. They push thoughts away, they avoid emotions, they reduce life to minimize disturbance. This may create temporary quiet, but it is fragile. The moment life moves again, peace shatters. Buddhist stillness is resilient. It remains even when movement returns. It does not depend on silence or simplicity. It depends on relationship. Understanding stillness as presence with flux changes how meditation is approached. Meditation is no longer about stopping thoughts. It is about noticing them without being carried away. Thoughts may continue. Stillness is in how they are met. This understanding reduces frustration. You stop judging practice by how quiet the mind becomes. You measure it by how gently you respond to what arises. Stillness also changes how conflict is experienced. Conflict does not mean peace has failed. It means conditions have shifted. When you remain present during conflict, stillness is still there. This does not mean passivity, it means clarity. From clarity, skillful response becomes possible. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises when we cling to how things should be. Wanting stillness to mean completion is another form of clinging. Letting go of this expectation frees peace from conditions. Peace becomes portable. It is no longer tied to circumstances. It moves with you through change. This understanding also helps with disappointment. When peace is expected to be permanent, any disturbance feels like loss. When peace is understood as presence, disturbance becomes part of the landscape. There is also humility here. You stop expecting enlightenment to remove humanity. You stop demanding that practice erase complexity. You allow yourself to be human and awake at the same time. Stillness as presence also changes how you relate to effort. You no longer try to force calm. You allow calm to emerge through non-resistance. Effort becomes gentle. This gentleness reduces burnout. You are not constantly trying to maintain a state. You trust awareness to meet experience. Flux includes joy as well as pain. When stillness does not require completion, joy is enjoyed without clinging. Sadness is felt without panic. Both are allowed. This allowance deepens emotional intelligence. You learn how to move with life rather than against it. Buddhist teachings often use the image of the sky and clouds. The sky does not stop clouds from moving, it remains open as they pass. Stillness is the sky, not the absence of clouds. This metaphor points to an important truth. Stillness is not fragile. It does not need protection. It does not collapse when things change. Understanding this reduces fear of disruption. You no longer fear that one difficult moment will undo everything. You trust that awareness remains. This trust changes how you face challenges. You stop bracing against them. You meet them with curiosity. Stillness as presence also affects decision-making. You do not wait for perfect calm to act. You act from clarity even when emotions are present. This prevents paralysis. Many people delay action because they are waiting to feel settled. Buddhism teaches that action and stillness can coexist. Stillness does not mean certainty. You can be still and unsure. You can be calm and confused. Peace does not require answers. This understanding is deeply liberating. It removes impossible standards. You stop demanding that inner life be clean before it is allowed. Stillness also allows grief to coexist with peace. You can mourn and still be grounded. You can feel loss and still feel present. This is not contradiction. It is depth. Many people believe grief cancels peace. Buddhism shows that resistance cancels peace. When grief is allowed, peace remains. This changes how long-term challenges are faced. Chronic conditions, ongoing uncertainty, unresolved situations. Peace is not postponed until they end. It exists alongside them. Stillness also transforms how success is held. Success does not define peace. Failure does not destroy it. Peace is not measured by outcomes. This creates emotional resilience. You are less shaken by external changes. Understanding peace as presence with flux also prepares you for aging and change. Bodies slow, roles shift, loss increases. Expecting completion would create despair. Presence allows adaptation. Buddhism does not promise a static paradise. It offers a way to live skillfully within impermanence. When stillness is no longer confused with completion, you stop waiting for life to settle. You start settling into life. This settling does not mean resignation. It means participation without resistance. You participate fully, knowing that movement will continue. This knowledge removes fear. Stillness also becomes more accessible. You stop searching for it. You recognize it in ordinary moments, while walking, while listening, while breathing. It is not dramatic. It is simple. It is always available. As stillness becomes something you can carry even while life keeps moving, one of the hardest places to practice that stillness appears. It is not in meditation. It is not in silence. It is in the heart when it remembers. Because some conflicts do not end cleanly, and some pain does not dissolve just because you understand impermanence. This is where forgiveness enters, not as a perfect solution, but as an unfinished human process. A strange guilt often shows up here. The guilt of not being over it. The guilt of still feeling hurt after time has passed. The guilt of not being able to forgive in the way people say you should. Many people carry this guilt quietly, and it becomes another form of suffering layered on top of the original wound. They tell themselves that acceptance means they must forgive fully, quickly, and with a peaceful smile. But Buddhism does not teach forced forgiveness. It teaches non-violence toward reality, and that includes non-violence toward your own heart. Forgiveness is often treated like a door you either open or keep shut. Either you forgive or you don't. Either you release it or you hold a grudge. But real inner life does not move in such clean lines. Forgiveness is more like weather. It shifts, it returns, it changes its intensity. Some days you feel open, some days you feel tight, some days you feel neutral. Some days the memory stings again. This is not hypocrisy. This is honesty. Unfinished forgiveness means allowing forgiveness to be partial, evolving, and real, rather than complete, sudden, and performative. It means you stop trying to force your nervous system to feel safe before it actually does. It means you stop demanding that one decision must erase a whole history of impact. Buddhist acceptance begins with the truth of what is here. If hurt is here, that is the starting point. If anger is here, that is the starting point. If the heart is not ready to release, that is the starting point. Any forgiveness built on denial is not forgiveness. It is suppression dressed up as virtue. And suppression has a cost. It often returns as bitterness, numbness, or a quiet distrust of yourself. There is also confusion because forgiveness is mixed up with approval. People think forgiving means saying what happened was okay. But forgiveness is not approval. It is not forgetting. It is not excusing. In Buddhist practice, forgiveness is closer to releasing the extra suffering created by clinging, while still seeing clearly what caused harm. You can hold clarity and forgiveness at the same time. You can say, "That was wrong," and still begin to loosen the grip of hatred. Unfinished forgiveness respects the reality that trust and forgiveness are not identical. You can forgive and still not trust someone. You can forgive and still keep distance. You can forgive and still maintain boundaries. Buddhism is not asking you to become defenseless. It is asking you to stop carrying poison in your own body. Resentment often feels like protection. It tells you, if I stay angry, I won't be hurt again. It tells you, if I don't forgive, I'm staying loyal to myself. Sometimes resentment truly is guarding a boundary that was ignored too long. Sometimes it is a signal that the harm has not been acknowledged. Unfinished forgiveness listens to this signal rather than shaming it. A lot of people try to forgive from the mind first. They decide they forgive because it sounds right, because it seems spiritual, because they want to be the bigger person. But the body still flinches, the heart still tightens, the memory still burns. This is where many people feel like failures. They think, I forgave, so why do I still feel this? The answer is simple. The decision is not the same as the integration. Buddhism understands that mind and body do not move at the same speed. The mind can choose a direction quickly. The nervous system learns safety slowly. Unfinished forgiveness allows both truths. You may choose not to feed hatred while still feeling hurt. You may choose not to retaliate while still feeling anger. You may choose not to replay revenge stories while still feeling the ache of what happened. This is not incomplete spirituality. This is human healing. Forgiveness also becomes complicated because people wanted to create an emotional finish line. They wanted to close the chapter. They wanted to stop the memory from returning. But forgiveness is not a spell. It does not erase consequence. It does not rewrite history. It simply changes the way you carry history. In Buddhist terms, forgiveness is often the release of clinging to the identity of the wounded one and the identity of the enemy. Not because those identities were never real, but because clinging to them keeps the mind trapped in a tight loop. You can acknowledge harm without living inside it every day. Unfinished forgiveness means you allow the loop to loosen gradually. Sometimes the first stage is not forgiveness at all. It is just stopping the constant replay. It is taking one breath when the memory hits instead of spiraling. It is choosing not to tell the same painful story again and again, just to keep the wound fresh. That choice is already a form of mercy toward yourself. There is also a sacred honesty in admitting, I cannot forgive this fully right now. That sentence is not a spiritual failure. It is awareness speaking. Buddhism respects awareness more than performance. When you tell the truth about where you are, you stop adding shame. Shame is often what blocks forgiveness the most, because it turns the inner world into a battlefield. Some people fear that if they don't forgive fully, they will become bitter forever. But bitterness is not caused by slow forgiveness. Bitterness is caused by clinging and suppression. Slow forgiveness, honest forgiveness, partial forgiveness can be healing because it keeps the heart open to movement without forcing it. One of the most important parts of unfinished forgiveness is letting time do its work. Time is not magic, but time allows new conditions, new understanding, new distance, new perspective. Not to justify what happened, but to see it from more angles. Sometimes forgiveness grows simply because your life grows. The event becomes one part of a bigger landscape. Buddhism also invites compassion, but not the kind that erases boundaries. Compassion means seeing that harm often comes from ignorance, fear, pain, and conditioning. This does not excuse it, it contextualizes it. When you see context, hatred has less fuel. You can still say no, you can still protect yourself, but you may stop wishing for their destruction. Sometimes the most honest forgiveness looks like this. You stop hoping they suffer. You stop spending your precious attention on them. You stop letting them live rent-free inside your mind. That is not weakness, that is reclamation. Unfinished forgiveness also includes forgiving yourself, which is often harder. Many people hold themselves to impossible standards. They replay the moment they stayed too long, trusted too much, said too little, said too much. Self-forgiveness is not pretending you did nothing wrong. It is releasing the belief that you deserve endless punishment. From a Buddhist view, you acted based on the conditions you had, your knowledge, your fear, your love, your habits, your wounds. Seeing this clearly allows responsibility without cruelty. You learn, you adjust, you bow to the lesson, then you stop stabbing yourself with it. Partial forgiveness can also mean forgiving certain parts, but not others. You may forgive the person's ignorance, but not their repeated harm. You may forgive a single moment, but not the pattern. You may forgive what they did, but still grieve what you lost. This is normal. The heart is not a courtroom delivering one final verdict. It is a living thing. Forgiveness also changes when truth is acknowledged. If the harm is denied, forgiveness becomes much harder because the nervous system feels unsafe. Unfinished forgiveness respects this. It does not demand openness in an environment of denial. Sometimes the first step is simply accepting that you may never receive acknowledgement. That is painful, but it stops the constant waiting. Waiting for someone to finally understand can keep the wound open indefinitely. Letting go of that expectation is a form of freedom. There is also a quiet difference between reconciliation and forgiveness. Reconciliation requires two people. Forgiveness can be internal. Buddhism never requires you to return to harm. You can forgive and still choose distance. In fact, sometimes distance is what makes forgiveness possible because it creates safety for the heart to soften. Unfinished forgiveness is also practical. It asks, what is the next smallest release I can do? Not the whole mountain, just one stone. Maybe it is letting go of a single insult you replay every day. Maybe it is letting go of the fantasy of the perfect apology. Maybe it is letting go of stalking their life mentally. Each small release reduces suffering. This approach prevents spiritual bypassing. Bypassing is when you use spiritual ideas to avoid your real feelings. You say, I forgive, while your body is still trembling. You say it's all love, while your heart is still enraged. Buddhism is not interested in pretty statements. It is interested in freedom from suffering, and freedom requires truth. Truth sometimes looks messy. It looks like forgiveness today and anger tomorrow. It looks like softness in the morning and tightness at night. It looks like being okay for weeks and then breaking down when a reminder appears. This does not mean you are going backward. It means the heart is moving in circles that slowly widen, slowly loosen, slowly release. Forgiveness that is forced tends to snap back. Forgiveness that is allowed tends to deepen. It deepens because it is real. It is built on awareness, not pressure. There is also an important insight here. Forgiveness is not only for the one who harmed you, it is for the part of you that is tired, tired of carrying the weight, tired of the inner argument, tired of the tension in the chest. When you see how exhaustion lives inside resentment, forgiveness becomes less like a moral duty and more like relief. But relief does not have to arrive all at once. Unfinished forgiveness allows gradual relief. It allows your heart to open in small ways, then rest, then open again. This rhythm is natural. A Buddhist way to support this is to return to intention, not outcome, not emotional perfection, just intention. Your intention might be, may I not add hatred to this pain, or may I not become what hurt me, or may I be free from this burden when I am ready. These intentions are gentle, they do not force, they guide. You may also notice that forgiveness becomes easier when you stop making it about them and start making it about you, not selfishly, but wisely. Your peace matters, your life matters, your attention is limited. Carrying resentment forever is like drinking poison and hoping the other person gets sick. Buddhism repeats this because it is true in lived experience. The harm happened once, but resentment can keep harming you daily. Unfinished forgiveness says, you do not have to keep paying for what happened. You can keep your clarity, your boundaries, your dignity, and still begin to release the extra suffering. You can let forgiveness be imperfect and still let it be real. And when you let forgiveness remain unfinished, something surprising happens. The mind stops demanding a clean ending. The heart stops pretending. You become more honest, and honesty is what heals. Not because it closes the past, but because it stops fighting it. As forgiveness is allowed to remain unfinished, something deeper quietly comes into view. A subtle unease that was never only about people, or memories, or justice. An unease that has been present underneath many struggles all along. The discomfort with things that do not end, the tension around what remains open, and beneath that tension, a fear that is rarely named directly. There is a strong link between our intolerance for unfinished experiences and our fear of death. Not because we think about death all the time, but because the mind is deeply unsettled by anything that does not resolve. Open endings feel unsafe, loose threads feel threatening, uncertainty feels like danger, and death at its core is the ultimate unfinished moment. No explanation, no closure, no final confirmation. Most people do not fear death as an event. They fear what it represents. The loss of control, the inability to finish, the fact that life does not conclude with a summary or a verdict. The same discomfort shows up in smaller ways every day, in unfinished conversations, in unresolved emotions, in questions that have no answers. The mind reacts to all of these in the same way. It tightens. When something is unfinished, the ego feels exposed. It cannot protect itself with conclusions. It cannot stabilize itself with certainty. This exposure triggers fear, and that fear often disguises itself as urgency. The urgency to fix, to complete, to close, to explain. This is why people rush forgiveness, rush healing, rush meaning, rush identity. They are not just trying to feel better. They are trying to escape the feeling of openness, because openness reminds the ego of impermanence, and impermanence reminds it of death. Buddhism does not avoid this connection. It moves directly toward it. It teaches that learning to live with unfinishedness is training for mortality. Not in a dark or morbid way, but in a liberating one. The fear of death is not only about physical ending. It is about not knowing. It is about not being able to control the final shape of things. When you practice acceptance with small open endings, you are gently retraining the nervous system to tolerate not knowing, to tolerate lack of closure, to tolerate change without collapse. This is why acceptance is so powerful. It dissolves fear not by offering certainty, but by building capacity. Capacity to stay present when the mind wants to flee. The intolerance for unfinishedness often shows up as anxiety. Anxiety is the mind anticipating an ending it cannot see. It imagines worst-case outcomes to regain a sense of control. It fills the unknown with threat, because threat feels more manageable than emptiness. Buddhist practice does not try to replace uncertainty with reassurance. It teaches you to stay with uncertainty long enough for the fear to soften. This softening is not intellectual, it is somatic. The body learns that openness does not equal danger. When the body learns this, the fear of death changes. It may not disappear, but it loses its sharpness. It becomes less personal, less urgent, less paralyzing. Death is the largest open ending. There is no rehearsal, no explanation that satisfies fully. Cultures create stories to manage this fear. Religions create narratives. Science creates models. These can be helpful. But Buddhism focuses less on explaining death and more on transforming our relationship to uncertainty itself. When you can sit with an unresolved feeling without panicking, you are practicing death acceptance in miniature. When you can allow a relationship to remain unfinished without forcing closure, you are practicing death acceptance in miniature. When you can let identity remain fluid without locking it down, you are practicing death acceptance in miniature. This does not mean becoming indifferent to life. It means becoming intimate with it. Intimacy requires openness, and openness includes the unknown. The fear of death also shows up as the need to leave a legacy, to be remembered, to have life make sense in the end. While this desire is human, it can also create pressure to make life coherent, pressure to justify existence, pressure to arrive at meaning before time runs out. Buddhism does not deny the desire for meaning. It questions the assumption that meaning must be completed. It suggests that meaning is lived, not concluded. When you stop demanding that life finish cleanly, death becomes less threatening. Not because it is explained, but because it is no longer treated as a failure. It is understood as part of the same impermanent movement that includes birth, growth, and change. Acceptance dissolves fear by removing resistance. Resistance to death is what creates terror. Acceptance does not mean liking death. It means not fighting the fact that everything changes. The mind often tries to protect itself by imagining control. If it can finish things, maybe it can avoid the unfinished ending of death. This illusion drives much of human behavior. Accumulation, achievement, perfectionism, legacy building. These are not wrong, but when driven by fear, they never satisfy. Buddhist acceptance invites a radical honesty. You cannot finish life. You can only live it. Trying to finish it creates suffering. Allowing it to remain unfinished creates peace. This peace does not come from certainty. It comes from trust. Trust that awareness can meet whatever arises. Trust that you do not need a final answer to live fully. The fear of open endings often shows up in how people avoid silence. Silence feels like a small death, a pause where nothing is happening. The mind rushes to fill it, with words, with thoughts, with noise. Learning to sit in silence is learning to sit with the unknown. Meditation is not about escaping death anxiety. It is about befriending uncertainty. Each breath comes and goes. You do not know how many breaths remain, and yet you breathe. This simple act becomes profound when seen clearly. You live without knowing the end. You have always done this. Acceptance simply makes it conscious. The fear of death also intensifies when identity is rigid. If you believe you are a fixed self, death feels like annihilation. Buddhism's teaching of non-self softens this fear, not by denying individuality, but by revealing that what you call self is already changing moment by moment. If identity is fluid, then death is not a sudden rupture, it is a continuation of change. This does not remove grief, but it reduces existential panic. Acceptance allows you to grieve without terror, to love without clinging, to live without demanding guarantees. When you stop needing open endings to close, you stop rehearsing death constantly. Many people live as if they are constantly preparing for the end, rushing, achieving, securing. Acceptance invites a different posture, presence. Presence is the antidote to death anxiety, not because it denies mortality, but because it removes the mental time travel that fuels fear. You are here, alive, aware. That is enough. This does not mean ignoring practical realities. Planning is fine. Responsibility is fine. What dissolves is the existential urgency, the belief that everything must be resolved before time runs out. Buddhism teaches that clinging to permanence creates suffering. Death fear is clinging at its most extreme. Letting go of this clinging does not require belief. It requires practice. Practice looks like staying with unfinishedness, letting things remain unresolved without panic, allowing questions to exist without answers, allowing life to be ambiguous. Over time, the nervous system learns something new. Open does not mean unsafe. Unknown does not mean catastrophic. Unfinished does not mean meaningless. This learning changes how you live. You slow down, you listen more deeply, you stop postponing peace, you stop waiting for life to make sense before enjoying it. The fear of death loses its grip because it no longer has a place to hook into. There is no frantic need to finish. There is no obsession with closure. There is just participation. Acceptance dissolves fear by removing the illusion that safety comes from certainty. Safety comes from awareness, from presence, from trust in your capacity to meet life. When you accept open endings, death becomes one of many open moments. Still mysterious, still profound, but no longer terrifying. This does not make life smaller, it makes it more precious. You stop wasting time arguing with reality. You start living. Life does not ask to be completed, it asks to be lived. What you have heard here is not an instruction to give up, but an invitation to stop fighting what was never meant to be finished. Unanswered questions, lingering emotions, unfinished forgiveness, shifting identity, open endings. None of these are failures. They are signs that life is still moving, still breathing, still shaping you. Acceptance is not closing the book. It is learning to read without demanding the final page. When you stop forcing closure, peace stops hiding in the future. It appears in the middle of uncertainty, in the pause before answers, in the space where nothing has resolved yet, and nothing needs to. This is where wisdom matures. This is where freedom quietly begins. If something in this teaching stayed with you, if one idea softened you or unsettled you in a good way, leave a comment and write, "I allow life to be unfinished." It helps others find these teachings, and it shows that you're walking this path consciously. And if you want to keep exploring wisdom that doesn't rush, truth that doesn't simplify, and peace that doesn't depend on endings, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More reflections like this are coming. Life doesn't need to be finished. You only need to stop resisting it.